After 20 years of blood, sweat, and grease spent restoring that 1969 cherry red Ford Mustang with my late wife, I walked into the garage to find nothing but an empty oil stain on the concrete. When I confronted my own son, he did not even look up from packing his designer suitcase. "I sold it," he said coldly. "Chloe wanted a VIP trip to Dubai for our anniversary. Get over it, old man. It was just a pile of rust taking up space." But the real shock came when my daughter-in-law smirked and revealed exactly how they managed to sell a car in my name. I just stood there and smiled, knowing what they did not. Before I tell you exactly how I ruined their lives and left them stranded in the desert, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic family member a lesson they will never forget. My name is Dexter Rollins. I am 75 years old, a retired chief engineer, and a man who spent 4 decades building high-rises in the bitter cold winds of Chicago. I know how to build a strong foundation, and more importantly, I know exactly how to demolish a rotten one. I am an African-American man who fought tooth and nail for every single dime I ever earned. I did not inherit wealth. I built it with calloused hands, late nights, and a mind that never stopped calculating. And everything I built for my family, for my late wife Vivian, and for our only son Kendrick. Vivian passed away exactly 1 year ago. Losing her took a piece of my soul that I will never get back. But before the cancer took her, she left me with memories. Our greatest shared memory sat in my garage. It was a 1969 Ford Mustang. We found it in a scrapyard 30 years ago. It was nothing but rusted metal and broken dreams when we dragged it home. But Vivian saw its potential. For 2 decades, we spent our weekends in that garage. We rebuilt the V8 engine together. She picked out the perfect cherry red paint. She hand-stitched the tiers in the original leather seats. That car was not just a vehicle. It was a metal capsule holding 20 years of our laughter, our arguments, our shared grease-stained hands, and our enduring love. That Tuesday morning began like any other. I woke up early, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and walked out to the garage to polish the chrome bumpers. It was a ritual that made me feel close to Vivian. But when I opened the door, the garage was empty. I blinked, my mind refusing to process the vacant space. There was just a faint smell of exhaust and a small drop of oil on the gray concrete. Panic, sharp and icy, gripped my chest for a fraction of a second. I thought someone had broken in. I thought we had been robbed. I turned on my heel and marched back into the house, ready to dial the police. But as I stepped into the living room, the reality of the situation hit me harder than any home invasion ever could. My 42-year-old son Kendrick and his 38-year-old wife Chloe were standing in the middle of my living room. The floor was covered with open Louis Vuitton suitcases. Clothes, expensive swimwear, and designer shoes were scattered everywhere. Kendrick was folding a silk shirt, completely ignoring my presence. Chloe was staring at her phone, tapping her manicured nails against the screen, obsessing over her social media feed as usual. "Kendrick," I said, my voice thick with confusion and rising dread. "The Mustang is gone. Did you see someone in the driveway? Did you hear anything last night?" Kendrick did not flinch. He did not look surprised. He carefully placed his folded shirt into the suitcase, zipped it up, and finally looked at me. His eyes that looked so much like his mother's, were completely devoid of warmth. "I sold it," he said, his voice flat and unapologetic. The words hung in the air. The silence in the room became suffocating. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to laugh and tell me he just moved it to the street to clean the garage. But his face remained entirely serious. "You sold it?" I repeated the syllables, feeling like ash in my mouth. "That was your mother's car." Kendrick rolled his eyes and let out a heavy, irritated sigh. "Dad, please do not start with the dramatic guilt trips. I sold it for $40,000 cash. Chloe has been stressed lately, and she really wanted to go to Dubai for our anniversary. We needed the funds to upgrade to first class and book a luxury suite. Get over it, old man. It was just a pile of rust taking up space in the garage." I felt the floor drop out from beneath me. The sheer disrespect, the absolute cruelty of his words paralyzed me. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders. This was the young man whose college tuition I paid in full, whose credit card debts I quietly settled so his credit score would not be ruined. And here he stood telling me that his mother's legacy was a pile of rust traded away for a frivolous vacation. Chloe finally looked up from her phone. She pushed her designer sunglasses up onto her blonde hair and gave me a smile that made my blood boil. It was a smile full of pity and condescension. "Honestly, Dexter, you should be thanking us," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. You barely even drive anymore. Your eyesight is not what it used to be. It is dangerous for a man your age to be handling a classic car. We did you a favor. Plus, Dubai is going to look absolutely stunning on my Instagram feed. We booked a private desert safari. You would not understand, you are too old-fashioned. My grief instantly evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of an engineer. My sadness vanished, making way for a sharp-focused anger. How did you sell it? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. The title is in a safe. The vehicle is registered in my name. No dealership or private buyer would touch that car without my legal signature on the transfer documents. Kendrick looked away, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. But Chloe did not look away. Her smirk widened into a triumphant grin. Well, Dexter, she said, taking a step closer to me. We know how much you have been struggling lately. You have been forgetting things, misplacing your keys, repeating stories. We were very concerned about your mental decline. I stared at her. I had never forgotten a single thing in my life. My mind was as sharp as a steel blade. I managed complex architectural blueprints every single day of my life. We spoke to a doctor. Chloe continued picking up her leather handbag. A very understanding doctor who agreed that you are showing early signs of severe senility. He wrote a nice little note for us. Based on that, we had a lawyer draft a medical power of attorney. You actually signed it yourself last week. Do you not remember? Oh, right, you are senile. She laughed, a high grating sound. I had brought them documents to sign for the house insurance renewal last week. They must have slipped the power of attorney into the stack of papers. They had forged my consent. They had legally declared me incompetent. You helped me sign away my rights, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Someone has to manage your estate before you lose it all, Kendrick chimed in, defending his wife. It is for your own good, Dad. You are not capable of making financial decisions anymore. The money from the car is already in our joint account. Do not try to call the police, or we will just show them the doctor's note and tell them you are having a paranoid episode. They will probably put you in a psychiatric ward. A horn honked outside. The black luxury SUV they had ordered for their airport transfer was idling in my driveway. Right on time, Chloe chirped, grabbing the handle of her suitcase. Have a good week, Dexter. Try not to burn the house down while we are gone. I hired a nurse to come check on you on Thursday. Do not forget to take your vitamins. Kendrick grabbed his bags. He paused at the door, looking back at me for a fraction of a second. There was a flicker of guilt, quickly swallowed by his towering entitlement. See you when we get back, Dad. Just relax. They walked out the front door. I stood perfectly still in my living room, listening to the heavy thud of the front door closing. I heard the trunk of the SUV slam shut. I heard the engine rev, and I listened as the tires rolled down the driveway, taking my son and his manipulative wife away to the airport. I did not scream. I did not throw anything against the wall. I did not collapse in a puddle of tears. I walked over to the window and watched their car disappear down the street. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I was just a tired, broken old black man who would sit in his rocking chair and accept defeat. They thought they had drained me of the only valuable thing I had left. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. They believed I was living off a modest pension. They believed the house and the car were my only assets. They did not know about the commercial real estate portfolio. They did not know about the offshore accounts. They did not know about the millions of dollars I had quietly amassed and hidden behind corporate trusts over the last 40 years. And most importantly, they did not know that my late wife Vivian was even smarter than I was. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I slowly pulled it out. The caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately. It was Vince Romano, the owner of the largest high-end classic car dealership in the state. He was a man who respected the hustle, a man who respected me. I answered the call, my voice steady and cold. Hello, Vince. Mr. Rollins. Vince said, his thick Italian accent sounding breathless and panicked over the line. I am so sorry to bother you so early. I need you to come down to my showroom right this second. What is it? Vince? Did my son just sell you a red '69 Mustang? Yes, sir, he did, Vince replied, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. He had all the paperwork, the power of attorney, the title. I thought you authorized it. I swear to God I thought you knew. But Mr. Rollins, that is not why I am calling. Then why are you calling Vince? My detail guys were vacuuming the interior, Vince explained. They were cleaning under the passenger seat. Mr. Rollins, they found a hidden compartment bolted to the floorboard, a biometric lockbox. We could not open it. But there is a sticky note attached to the top of it. It has your name on it, and it is in your wife's handwriting. Sir, your wife left something inside that car. You need to get here right away. I ended the call. The silence in the house felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a victim. It was the silence before a storm. Kendrick and Chloe thought they were flying to a luxurious paradise in the Middle East. They thought they had stolen my past to fund their future. But as I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, I made a silent promise to Vivian. I was going to let them land in Dubai. I was going to let them check into their 5-star resort. And then I was going to cut the financial cord and leave them stranded in the burning desert thousands of miles away from home with absolutely nothing. The game had just begun. The silence in my house was absolute. It was not the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a structure that had just sustained critical damage. I walked back into the living room and looked at the empty space where their designer suitcases had been resting just minutes ago. My son Kendrick and his wife Chloe were gone. They were on their way to the airport, heading to Dubai on a luxury vacation funded by my stolen memories. For 40 years, I worked as a chief engineer in Chicago. My job was to look at a skyscraper and know exactly where the stress points were. I knew how to spot a crack in the foundation before it brought the whole building down. Today, my own family was the crumbling foundation. I did not sit down and weep. I did not pour myself a drink to numb the pain. I stood in the middle of my living room and let my mind shift gears. Grief is a luxury you can afford when the danger has passed. Right now, I was in the middle of a collapse and I needed to assess the damage. My cell phone vibrated in my pocket. The sudden noise was sharp in the quiet house. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The caller ID showed the name Vince Romano. Vince was a 55-year-old Italian-American businessman who owned the most prestigious classic car dealership in the state. He was a man who respected hard work and authenticity. He and I had shared many cups of coffee over the years, talking about classic engines and the beauty of restoring old machines. I answered the call and pressed the phone to my ear. "Hello, Vince," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Mr. Rollins," Vince replied. His voice was frantic. The usual smooth confidence of a seasoned car dealer was completely gone. He sounded like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. "I am so sorry to bother you so early, sir. I need you to come down to my showroom right this second." "What is it, Vince?" I asked. "Did my son just sell you a red 1969 Mustang?" "Yes, sir, he did," Vince replied, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He had all the paperwork. He had the title and a medical power of attorney. I thought you authorized it, Mr. Rollins. I swear to God I thought you knew about the sale. I would never take advantage of you." I told him to calm down. I knew Vince was an honest man. Kendrick and Chloe had forged a medical document claiming I was senile. They had the legal cover to fool anyone. I told Vince I did not blame him for the transaction. "Then why are you calling me Vince?" I asked. "My detail guys were vacuuming the interior," Vince explained. His voice dropped to a nervous whisper. They were cleaning under the passenger seat, getting it ready for the showroom floor. "Mr. Rollins, they found a hidden compartment bolted directly to the floorboard. It is a small lockbox with a biometric fingerprint scanner. We could not open it without breaking it. But there is a sticky note attached right to the top of it. It has your name on it, Mr. Rollins, and it is in your wife's handwriting. Sir, your wife left something inside that car. You need to get down here right away." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. My heart, which had been beating with a slow and steady anger, suddenly skipped a beat. Vivian, my beautiful, brilliant Vivian, had left something behind. She passed away from cancer exactly 1 year ago. In her final months, she was weak and frail, but her mind remained sharper than anyone else I knew. She handled our private affairs with unmatched precision. Why would she install a biometric lockbox in the Mustang? Why would she hide it under the passenger seat where she always sat during our Sunday drives? I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter and walked out the front door. I got into my daily driver, an unassuming black sedan, and started the engine. As I pulled out of my driveway and headed toward the commercial district, my engineer brain shifted into maximum overdrive. I bypassed the sorrow completely. Emotion clouds judgment, and right now I needed absolute clarity. I thought back to Vivian's final days in the hospice. Chloe and Kendrick were always hovering around her room. They claimed they wanted to spend precious time with her. But I always caught Chloe looking through our mail or asking subtle questions about Vivian's life insurance policies. Vivian never trusted Chloe. My wife had an instinct for spotting people who were rotten on the inside. She warned me once that Chloe was a parasite feeding on Kendrick's insecurities. I thought Vivian was just being protective of her only son. I never imagined Chloe was actually plotting to steal our entire lives. The drive to the dealership felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes away. I watched the city streets pass by my window. People were drinking coffee, walking their dogs, and living their normal lives. They had no idea that a 75-year-old African-American man was driving right past them, preparing to dismantle his own son's life piece by piece. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. Kendrick had always taken the easy way out. I paid for his college tuition so he would not have student loans. I bailed him out when he made bad investments in his 20s. I wanted to give him the head start that I never had. I grew up with nothing and built an empire through sweat and concrete. I thought shielding my son from the harsh realities of the world would make him a better man. Instead, it made him weak. And when he married Chloe, that weakness mutated into entitlement. They thought I was just a tired old man living on a fixed pension. They had no idea about the commercial real estate portfolio I had quietly built over the decades. They had no idea about the millions I had stashed in secure trusts. Vivian knew, though. She managed the books, she knew our true net worth, and she knew that if Kendrick and Chloe ever found out, they would circle us like vultures. Vivian hid something from me for a reason. She knew my temper. She knew that if I found out about a betrayal while she was still alive, I would have destroyed Kendrick immediately. She hid that box so I would find it only when the time was right, and that time was today. I pulled into the large parking lot of Romano Classic Motors. The building was a massive glass and steel structure housing millions of dollars worth of automotive history. Inside, there were vintage Cadillacs, restored Chevrolets, and pristine European sports cars. But I only cared about one vehicle today. I parked my sedan and walked through the heavy glass doors of the showroom. The receptionist recognized me immediately and pointed toward the private detailing bays in the back of the building. I walked past the gleaming cars, my footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floor. Vince was standing outside, detailing bay number 4. He was pacing back and forth, running a hand through his graying hair. When he saw me, he rushed forward and extended his hand. "Mr. Rollins, I am so glad you got here fast," Vince said, shaking my hand firmly. I ordered my guys to step away from the vehicle as soon as I saw the note. Nobody has touched it since. "I appreciate your discretion, Vince," I said, keeping my posture completely straight. "Where is she?" Vince led me into the brightly lit bay, and there she was, my 1969 cherry red Ford Mustang. The paint was gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The chrome bumpers shined like mirrors. Seeing the car again sent a sharp pang of memory through my chest. I remembered Vivian laughing in the passenger seat with the windows down and the radio playing classic soul music. I pushed the memory aside and focused on the task at hand. Vince opened the passenger side door. He pointed to a section of the carpet that had been carefully pulled back. I kneeled down and looked under the seat. Bolted directly into the heavy steel chassis of the car was a sleek black metal box. It was a high-grade biometric safe, the kind of safe you use to store diamonds or highly sensitive corporate documents. I ran my fingers over the cold metal, examining the installation. The bolts were industrial grade. The wiring for the scanner was spliced seamlessly into the car battery line so it would never lose power. It was an engineering masterpiece. Vivian must have hired a specialist to install it while I was away on business trips. It was perfectly concealed. If Kendrick had sold the car to a private street buyer, the new owner might have never found it. But Vince ran a high-end operation where his detailers cleaned every hidden inch of a vehicle with bright lights and heavy vacuums. Vivian must have known the safe would eventually be discovered if the car ever changed hands. She knew Kendrick was too lazy to search the car himself before selling it. He just wanted a quick payday for his fancy vacation. Stuck to the surface of the safe was a small yellow sticky note. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Vivian's elegant cursive script. The ink was slightly faded, but the message was clear. The note simply read, "For Dexter, when the truth finally comes out." I stared at those words for a long time. When the truth finally comes out. She knew. Even in her final days fighting a terminal illness, my beautiful wife was 10 steps ahead of everyone else. She knew Chloe was manipulating our son. She knew they were going to come for our assets the moment she was gone. And she knew they would eventually target the Mustang because it was the easiest piece of property to liquidate quickly. She set a trap from beyond the grave, and my greedy son walked right into it. I took a deep breath and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The machine beeped once and a small green light blinked. The heavy metal lid popped open with a soft click. Vince stood behind me, completely silent, respecting the gravity of the moment. I reached inside the box. I did not find cash or jewelry. Instead, my fingers brushed against a small digital voice recorder and a thick leather-bound diary. It was Vivian's personal journal from her time in hospice care. I lifted the recorder out of the box. The plastic was cold against my palm. I knew that whatever was on this device was going to change my life forever. I knew it was going to sever the final bond between a father and his son. I stood up holding the recorder tightly. I looked at Vince. His eyes were full of sympathy and quiet understanding. "Vince," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "I need a private office for 10 minutes. And then I am going to need to look at that bill of sale my son signed, because whoever he thinks he is dealing with, he just made the biggest mistake of his miserable life." Vince Romano led me away from the bright lights of the detailing bay and into his private office at the back of the showroom. The walls were lined with framed photographs of vintage cars and old racing memorabilia. Vince closed the heavy wooden door behind us, cutting off the hum of the polishing machines and the chatter of his mechanics. The sudden quiet in the room was heavy. Vince gestured to his large mahogany desk, offered me a glass of water, and then quietly stepped out, closing the door softly. He was a man who understood that some storms need to be weathered alone. I stood in the center of the unfamiliar office, holding the small digital voice recorder and the worn leather-bound diary. My large calloused hands practically swallowed the fragile items. For 40 years, my hands had poured concrete welded steel and built structures designed to withstand the harshest Chicago winters. But holding these last remnants of my wife Vivian, my hands felt entirely inadequate. I walked over to the leather chair behind the desk and sat down. I placed the digital recorder on the smooth wooden surface. Beside it, I laid the diary. The leather cover was soft, distressed at the edges from years of use. Vivian had always been a meticulous woman. While I built the buildings, she managed the foundation of our lives. She kept the books, tracked the offshore investments, and handled the commercial real estate portfolio that made us quietly wealthy. We never flaunted our $12 million net worth. We drove normal cars. We lived in a nice but unassuming neighborhood. We wanted our son Kendrick to learn the value of a dollar earned through honest sweat. We failed. I opened the diary. The pages were filled with Vivian's precise, elegant cursive handwriting. I recognized the ink. It was the blue pen she always kept on her nightstand during her final months in the hospice facility. As I read the entries, the air in the office seemed to grow colder. Vivian did not write about her pain or her fear of the cancer that was slowly taking her life. She wrote about her observations. She wrote about our son and his wife. The entry, dated 3 weeks before her passing, was a clinical assessment of a threat. Vivian wrote that Chloe was asking too many questions about the estate planning. She noted that Chloe had been caught snooping through the legal documents we kept in a locked filing cabinet at home. Vivian wrote that Kendrick was growing impatient. He was drowning in debt. She noticed his expensive watches, the designer bags Chloe flaunted, and she did the math. Vivian knew they were living far beyond the salary of a mid-level sales manager. She wrote Dexter, "If you are reading this, it means they have finally made their move. I tried to shield you from their true nature because I knew it would break your heart. But Chloe is a parasite, and Kendrick has allowed her to infect his soul. They are looking for the primary trust documents. I moved the assets behind a secondary corporate wall. They cannot access the main funds without your signature, but they will try to manipulate you. Listen to the tape." "I am so sorry, my love." I closed the diary. My chest felt incredibly tight. The air in the room felt thin. Vivian had spent her final days on Earth protecting me. While her body was failing, her mind was actively building barricades to secure our legacy against our own flesh and blood. I looked at the small black digital recorder resting on the desk. I knew that pressing the play button would fundamentally alter the rest of my life. It would erase the boy I raised and replace him with a stranger. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs, and pressed play. The speaker crackled with a soft hiss of static. Then the rhythmic, steady beeping of a hospital heart monitor filled the quiet office. I closed my eyes. I was instantly transported back to that sterile hospice room. I could smell the sharp scent of antiseptic and the faint floral perfume Vivian always wore. I could see her frail body resting under the thin white blankets. Then a voice cut through the static. It was Chloe. But it was not the sickly sweet, high-pitched voice she used around me at family dinners. The tone was completely different. It was guttural, harsh, and dripping with venom. "Listen to me, you stubborn old hag," Chloe hissed on the recording. The sound of rustling paper followed. "I have the trust transfer documents right here. The lawyer says all we need is your signature while you are still lucid. Sign the paper, Vivian. I heard Vivian's breathing. It was shallow and labored. Her voice when she spoke was barely a whisper, but the defiance in it was unmistakable. I will never give you control of my husband's money, Vivian whispered. You will drain him dry. A sharp, aggressive laugh erupted from Chloe. Your husband is a dinosaur, Vivian. He belongs in a nursing home. Kendrick and I have real plans. We have a lifestyle to maintain. If you do not sign this document right now, I am going to walk out into that hallway, find the attending nurse, and tell her you are refusing your pain medication. I will tell them you want to go natural. I will make sure Kendrick agrees with me. We are your medical proxies right now while Dexter is out of town. We will cut off your morphine, Vivian. You will feel every single cancer cell eating your bones until you finally die. My blood turned to absolute ice. My heart, which had been breaking just moments before, simply stopped mourning. The grief evaporated instantly, incinerated by a white-hot, blinding rage. This woman, this intruder who slept in my son's bed, had threatened to torture my dying wife. She had threatened to take away the only mercy Vivian had left in her final days. I waited for the next voice on the tape. I waited for my son. I waited for Kendrick to storm into the room to pull his wife away from his mother's deathbed, to scream at her to protect the woman who gave him life. I waited for the boy I raised to be a man. The door clicked open on the recording. Footsteps approached the bed. Kendrick, Chloe said, her voice dropping the venom and adopting a manipulative whine. Your mother is being difficult. She will not sign the papers. We need that money to cover the margin calls on the penthouse. Tell her to sign it. I held my breath. The silence on the tape felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Then Kendrick spoke. His voice was calm. It was not angry. It was not conflicted. It was completely, chillingly indifferent. Just sign it, Mom, Kendrick said. The words were flat, devoid of any emotional connection. We really need the liquidity right now. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Your money is basically mine anyway. Just give it to us early so we do not have to deal with probate court when you are gone. There was no outrage. There was no defense of his mother. Kendrick was completely complicit. He was standing in a hospice room watching his wife threaten to withhold pain medication from his dying mother, and his only concern was avoiding probate court so he could get his hands on the cash. The recording captured Vivian's weak, rattling breath. You are no son of mine, she whispered. The tape clicked and went dead. I sat in the heavy leather chair for a long, immeasurable amount of time. The silence in Vince Romano's office rushed back in, but it felt entirely different now. The world had shifted on its axis. 42 years ago, I held a tiny, crying baby boy in the maternity ward of a Chicago hospital. I promised the universe I would protect him, guide him, and give him a life better than the poverty I had known. I poured every ounce of my soul into raising a strong, honorable man. I had failed. I had not raised a man, I had raised a parasite. And that parasite had brought a predator into my home. They had tormented the woman I loved in her darkest, most vulnerable hour. They had looked at my wife's terminal illness not as a tragedy, but as a financial opportunity. And earlier this very morning, they had looked me in the eye, called me a senile old man, and sold Vivian's prized possession to fund a luxury vacation in Dubai. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully manipulated the system, forged the documents, and secured their luxurious future. They believed they were flying toward a desert paradise, leaving a broken, confused old man behind in the dust. I slowly reached out and picked up the digital recorder. I slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket. I picked up Vivian's diary and held it against my chest for a brief moment, making a silent vow to the woman who had fought for me until her last breath. The sorrow was completely gone. In its place was a cold, engineered precision. I spent my entire career designing structural frameworks that could withstand immense pressure. I knew how to build, but more importantly, I knew the exact mathematical formula required to bring a massive structure crashing to the ground. I knew exactly which support beams to kick out. I knew exactly which load-bearing walls to detonate. Kendrick and Chloe had built their entire lavish lifestyle on a foundation of lies, stolen credit, and my unspoken financial backing. I owned the penthouse they lived in. I guaranteed the platinum credit cards they were using to drink champagne in first class. I controlled the very ground they walked on. I stood up from the desk. I did not feel 75 years old. I felt like a force of nature. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket, my mind already calculating the sequence of events. I was not going to call the police right now. An arrest at a local precinct was too good for them. It was too easy. I walked to the office door and opened it, stepping back out into the bright, polished showroom. Vince Romano looked up from his clipboard, his eyes scanning my face for a reaction. He was expecting to see a shattered, weeping old man. Instead, he saw the chief engineer. "Vince," I said, my voice echoing slightly off the high ceilings of the dealership. "I need to make a phone call to my legal team. And then you and I are going to do some paperwork. Keep the car in the back. Nobody touches it." "Yes, sir," Vince replied, immediately sensing the absolute authority in my tone. I walked out the glass doors into the bright morning sun. Kendrick and Chloe were currently 30,000 feet in the air, flying toward the Middle East. They were dreaming of five-star hotels, private safaris, and endless luxury. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the private number for my wealth management attorneys. It was time to cut the support cables. It was time to let gravity do its work. They wanted a trip to Dubai. I was going to make sure it was a trip they would never, ever forget. I stepped out of the small private office and back into the brightly lit showroom of Romano Classic Motors. The heavy wooden door closed behind me with a solid thud that echoed across the polished concrete floor. The scent of car wax and expensive leather filled the air, but I barely noticed it. My mind was still processing the horrific audio recording I had just listened to. I could still hear the sound of Chloe threatening my dying wife. I could still hear the cold indifference in my son Kendrick's voice. The grief that had been a constant companion for the past year was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, calculating focus. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was an engineer looking at a structure that needed to be systematically dismantled. Vince Romano was waiting for me near the front reception desk. He was a seasoned businessman who had seen a lot of things in his life, but right now he looked nervous. He saw the change in my posture. He saw the coldness in my eyes. He did not ask what was on the tape. He simply stood there, waiting for my instructions. "Vince," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "I need to see the paperwork. I need to see every single document my son gave you when he sold you my car." Vince swallowed hard and nodded. "Right this way, Mr. Rollins." He led me behind the reception counter and into his main administrative office. He unlocked a heavy metal filing cabinet and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed it on the wide glass desk in front of me. I opened the folder and spread the documents out under the bright desk lamp. I have spent my entire life analyzing architectural blueprints, looking for minute errors that could compromise a building. I applied that same intense scrutiny to the papers in front of me. There was the standard bill of sale. There was the transfer of title. And there it was. The document they had used to bypass my authority, a medical power of attorney. I picked up the power of attorney and held it close to the light. It was printed on official-looking legal paper. It stated that due to severe cognitive decline and early-onset dementia, I, Dexter Rollins, was no longer capable of making financial or legal decisions. It designated Kendrick as my sole legal proxy. Attached to it was a letter supposedly written by a doctor confirming my mental deterioration. I read the doctor's name. It was a clinic located in a shady part of town known for providing whatever paperwork you needed as long as you had enough cash. Then I looked at the signatures. I looked at the signature on the bill of sale and the signature transferring the title. They had not just used the power of attorney to force the sale, they had actually tried to forge my signature on the title transfer to make the transaction look cleaner to the Department of Motor Vehicles. I stared at the ink. It was a sloppy, hasty forgery. They had tried to mimic the sharp, aggressive loops of my handwriting, but the pressure was all wrong. The pen strokes were hesitant and weak. It lacked the steady, confident flow of a man who had signed off on multi-million-dollar construction contracts for 40 years. I knew immediately who wrote it. Kendrick was too lazy to practice a forgery. Chloe, on the other hand, always thought she was smarter than everyone else in the room. I could see her handwriting bleeding through the fake signature. The way the letters curved at the end was exactly how she wrote her name on the arrogant holiday cards she sent out every year. "Look at this, Vince," I said, pointing a calloused finger at the signature line on the vehicle title. "Look at the pressure of the pen. Look at how the ink pools at the bottom of the letters. That is hesitation. That is the hand of someone trying to copy a signature they do not understand." Vince leaned in closer, putting on his reading glasses. His face turned pale as he examined the ink. "Now look at this," I continued, sliding the medical power of attorney toward him. "Look at the notary stamp at the bottom of the page. The seal is supposed to authenticate the document and prove that I was physically present when this was signed. But look at the expiration date on the stamp. It is completely blurred. And the registration number of the notary public is missing 2 digits. This is a fake stamp, Vince. They bought a counterfeit notary seal online to make this look legitimate. Vince took a step back from the desk. His hands started to shake. The color completely drained from his face as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. He was a legitimate business owner with a pristine reputation in the classic car community. He realized in that exact moment that he had just facilitated a massive felony. "Mr. Rollins." Vince stammered, his voice rising in panic. "I swear to you I did not know. The paperwork looked completely standard when they brought it in. Your son was dressed in a sharp suit. His wife was carrying a designer bag. They spoke so confidently. They said you were moving into an assisted living facility and needed the cash to cover the medical expenses. I thought I was helping your family out by taking the car off your hands quickly. Oh my God, Mr. Rollins, I just bought a stolen car. I just processed a fraudulent title. The authorities are going to shut down my dealership. I could lose my business license. I could go to prison for receiving stolen property." Vince began to pace around the small office, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. He was terrified, and he had every right to be. Grand theft auto is a serious crime, but when you involve forged legal documents, fake notary stamps, and the exploitation of a senior citizen, it becomes a federal nightmare. I watched him panic for a few seconds before I decided to step in. I needed Vince on my side. I needed him to be calm and collected because he was now a key witness in the destruction of my son. "Vince," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a sharp knife. "Stop pacing. Look at me." Vince stopped and looked at me, his chest heaving. "I am not going to let you lose your dealership," I told him. "You are an honest man who got conned by two very professional predators. You are a victim in this transaction just like I am. I am not going to call the police and tell them you knowingly bought a stolen car, but I need you to listen to me very carefully." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out my personal checkbook. It was not a standard pension checking account. It was the primary checkbook for one of my commercial holding companies. I clicked my pen and flattened the checkbook on his glass desk. "How much did you pay my son for the Mustang?" I asked. $40,000, Vince replied, his voice trembling. "I wired the funds directly into their joint account just 2 hours ago. They said they needed the liquidity immediately." I nodded. I knew the car was worth at least $80,000 in the current collector market. Kendrick had sold it for half its value just so he and his greedy wife could afford a luxury vacation in Dubai. The sheer stupidity of their greed was astounding. I began to write on the check. I filled out the date. I wrote the name Romano Classic Motors on the payee line. Then I moved to the amount box. I did not write $40,000. I wrote $100,000. I signed my actual signature at the bottom, bold and unmistakable. I tore the check from the booklet and tossed it across the desk toward Vince. Vince looked down at the piece of paper. His eyes widened in absolute shock when he read the amount. $100,000. "Mr. Rollins," Vince whispered, staring at the check as if it were a mirage. "I do not understand. You do not owe me this. The car is yours. I will give it back to you right now. I will eat the $40,000 loss. Just please do not let the police take my business." "Keep the change, Vince," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You paid $40,000 to my son. This check reimburses you for that loss and gives you a $60,000 bonus. The car stays here in your secure garage until I say otherwise. Consider that money a premium storage fee, but more importantly, consider it payment for your absolute silence and your total cooperation." Vince looked up from the check. He swallowed hard. "Cooperation for what, Mr. Rollins?" "You are going to help me nail them," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. "You are going to make copies of every single piece of paper they gave you. You are going to pull the security camera footage from your showroom, showing them presenting these forged documents. And you are going to hand all of it over to my private legal team." Vince nodded eagerly, clutching the check in his hand. "Yes, sir, absolutely. Anything you need. But should we not call the local police right now? We could have them arrested before they even leave the city." I shook my head. "No. Local police means local courts. Local courts mean bail hearings and plea deals and slap-on-the-wrist probation sentences for first-time offenders. That is not good enough for what they did to my wife." I leaned over the desk, placing my hands flat on the glass. I needed Vince to understand the absolute gravity of the trap I was building. "What my son and his wife did today was not a simple family dispute," Vince, I explained, laying out the legal reality. "By using a forged medical power of attorney to sell a vehicle, they committed grand theft auto. By faking a notary stamp on a state document, they committed forgery and identity theft. And by having you wire that $40,000 across state lines into their bank account, they just elevated this entire situation to federal wire fraud. Vince stared at me, his jaw slightly open as he processed the magnitude of the crimes. They are currently on a plane heading to Dubai, I continued. They think they have won. They think they are untouchable. I am going to let them land in that desert. I am going to let them walk into their 5-star hotel, and then I'm going to freeze every single financial asset they have. I am going to leave them stranded in a foreign country with absolutely nothing. And while they are begging for mercy in the desert, my lawyers will be handing this federal case over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I picked up the forged power of attorney and carefully placed it back into the manila folder. I closed the folder and handed it to Vince. When they finally manage to crawl back to the United States, there will not be a local police officer waiting for them, I said. There will be federal agents waiting at the airport gate with handcuffs. They are going to federal prison, Vince. And your security footage is going to be the final nail in their coffin. Vince Romano stood up straight. The panic had completely left his body, replaced by a profound respect and a healthy dose of fear. He carefully took the folder and locked it back inside his filing cabinet. I will get the security footage backed up onto a secure drive right now, Mr. Rollins, Vince said, his voice firm and resolute. Nobody will know a thing until you are ready to drop the hammer. Thank you, Vince, I said. I turned around and walked out of the office. I walked past the cherry red Mustang resting under the bright lights of the detailing bay. I did not feel sad looking at it anymore. The car had served its purpose. It had delivered Vivian's final message. It had given me the keys to destroy the parasites that had invaded my family. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the dealership and stepped out into the crisp morning air. I walked to my black sedan, unlocked the door, and got inside. I sat behind the steering wheel for a moment, watching the traffic flow by on the busy street. Kendrick and Chloe were in the sky right now, drinking complimentary champagne and laughing about how easily they had fooled the old man. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed the private number for my elite wealth management team. It was time to access the hidden empire. It was time to start freezing accounts and cutting the financial lifelines. They wanted a luxury vacation in Dubai. I was going to make sure it was the most expensive, excruciating nightmare they would ever experience. The destruction of Kendrick and Chloe had officially begun. I drove away from Romano Classic Motors with a clarity I had not felt in 12 months. The heavy, suffocating fog of grief that had wrapped around my chest since Vivian passed away was entirely gone. In its place was a cold and calculating focus, the kind of focus I used to have when I stood on the edge of a 60-story steel framework with the freezing wind of Lake Michigan whipping across my face. I navigated my unassuming black sedan through the busy city streets, blending in perfectly with the morning traffic. To anyone looking at me, I was just another tired 75-year-old African-American man driving a practical car on his way to the grocery store or the pharmacy. A senior citizen living on a fixed income, quietly waiting for the clock to run out. That was exactly what my son Kendrick believed. That was exactly what his greedy wife Chloe banked on. They looked at my modest 3-bedroom home, my practical clothes, and my quiet demeanor, and they saw weakness. They saw a man who had worked his whole life just to survive and who was now slipping into the helpless fog of senility. They thought they had squeezed the last drops of value out of me by forging my signature and selling my beautiful 1969 Mustang for $40,000. They thought they were leaving a broke, confused old man behind as they flew off to their luxurious vacation in Dubai. They were so incredibly wrong. I pulled into my driveway and parked the sedan. I walked up to the front door, turned the key, and stepped inside the quiet house. I locked the deadbolt behind me and activated the home security system. The house was exactly as they had left it. There was a coffee mug sitting in the sink and a discarded clothing tag on the living room floor. I ignored the mess and walked straight down the hallway toward my private study at the back of the house. I closed the heavy oak door of the study and locked it. I walked over to the large bookshelf that covered the far wall. The shelves were filled with old engineering manuals, architecture books, and history volumes. I reached behind a thick encyclopedia on the third shelf and pressed a hidden latch. The bookshelf clicked and swung open silently on hidden hinges, revealing a small reinforced steel safe embedded directly into the foundation of the house. I placed my thumb on the biometric scanner. The light flashed green and the heavy steel door popped open. I reached inside and pulled out a thick encrypted matte black laptop. It was not connected to the public home internet. It operated on a secure private network. I carried the laptop to my solid oak desk, sat down in my leather chair, and booted it up. As the screen glowed to life, illuminating my face in the dim room, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this exact moment. I thought about the 1970s in Chicago. Being a young black engineer in those days was not just a job, it was a daily war. I had to be twice as smart and work 3 times as hard just to be allowed in the room. I spent decades walking on active construction sites, breathing in concrete dust and diesel fumes, managing crews of men who initially did not want to take orders from someone who looked like me. But I earned their respect through sheer competence and unbreakable grit. I made a very good salary as a chief engineer, but I never bought flashy cars or expensive watches. Vivian and I had a different vision. Vivian was a genius with numbers. While I was out building high-rises, she was at home studying the real estate market. She knew that true wealth was not what you wore on your wrist or what you parked in your driveway. True wealth was silent. True wealth was owning the land beneath the buildings. In the late 1980s, we took our savings and bought a small rundown commercial lot on the south side of the city. We held on to it until the neighborhood was gentrified and then sold it for 10 times what we paid. We took that money and bought a small strip mall, then an office building, then a series of high-end residential complexes. Vivian set up a complex web of corporate trusts and limited liability companies. On paper, Dexter and Vivian Rollins were just a retired engineer and a former school teacher. But behind the corporate veil, we were a completely different entity. I typed my complex alphanumeric password into the laptop and pressed enter. The screen loaded into my private wealth management portal. I stared at the numbers glowing on the screen. The total net worth sitting across various diversified portfolios, offshore accounts, and commercial real estate holdings was over $12 million. $12 million. Built off calloused hands, late nights, and decades of financial discipline. We kept this a secret from Kendrick for a reason. We wanted him to have the hunger that we had. We wanted him to build his own legacy. I paid for his education so he would not start his life in debt, but after that, I wanted him to fly on his own. I wanted him to understand the value of a hard-earned dollar. But Kendrick never inherited my grit, and he certainly never inherited his mother's brilliant mind. He only wanted the reward without the sacrifice. And when he met Chloe, that entitlement exploded into full-blown delusion. Chloe was a woman who lived for the perception of wealth. She cared only about designer labels, expensive vacations, and impressing strangers on the internet. She fed Kendrick's insecurities, telling him he deserved a life of luxury right now. I clicked the mouse and opened the specific file detailing my residential holdings. My eyes scanned down the list of properties owned by my primary holding company, Vanguard Horizon Investments. I stopped at a familiar address located in the upscale downtown financial district. It was a luxury high-rise building with floor-to-ceiling windows, private elevators, and a rooftop garden. I clicked on unit number 4200, the penthouse suite. Kendrick and Chloe lived in that exact penthouse. They paid $8,000 a month in rent, and they constantly bragged to their friends about their sophisticated urban lifestyle. Kendrick thought he had negotiated a brilliant lease agreement with a faceless corporate management company. He thought he had secured his dream home entirely on his own merit. He had no idea that I was the sole owner of Vanguard Horizon Investments. I owned the very floor he walked on. I owned the roof over his head. When his rental application originally crossed the desk of my property manager 2 years ago, Kendrick's credit was absolute garbage. He was drowning in hidden debts, trying to keep up with Chloe's spending habits. Any normal landlord would have thrown his application straight into the trash. But I intervened in secret. I instructed my property manager to approve the lease. I subsidized their rent from the shadows, allowing them to live in luxury because I still foolishly believed I could quietly protect my son while he found his footing. I clicked another tab on my laptop, opening the banking portal. I navigated to a specific set of platinum credit card accounts. Kendrick and Chloe were currently using these exact cards to fund their extravagant lifestyle. They used them to buy their designer clothes, their expensive dinners, and their first-class flight upgrades to Dubai. Chloe proudly carried that heavy metal card in her purse, believing it was a symbol of her high status. But Kendrick's income as a mid-level sales manager could never qualify him for an unlimited platinum card. Once again, I had stepped into the shadows to protect him. I was the silent guarantor on every single one of those accounts. My $12 million corporate portfolio was the only reason the bank allowed them to swipe that card. They were living a beautiful, glamorous lie, and I was the one quietly paying the invisible toll. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and steepled my fingers, staring at the glowing screen. The sheer irony of the situation washed over me. My son and his wife had stood in my living room just a few hours ago calling me a senile, useless old man. They had forged my signature on a medical document to steal $40,000 from me because they thought it was the only money I had left to give. They had threatened my dying wife to try and get their hands on a few $1,000s in a checking account. They thought they had squeezed the stone dry. They thought they had won. They were currently soaring over the Atlantic Ocean, posting pictures of their champagne glasses to social media, believing they had successfully discarded a helpless old fool. They had absolutely no idea that the helpless old fool they left behind controlled every single aspect of their financial existence. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small digital voice recorder I had retrieved from the Mustang. I placed it gently on the desk next to the laptop. I looked at it, remembering Vivian's final rattling breaths and the cruel, venomous words Chloe had spit at her. I remembered Kendrick telling his dying mother that her money was basically his anyway. The last remaining shred of paternal hesitation vanished from my heart. I did not feel sorrow for what I was about to do. I only felt a cold, righteous sense of duty. Vivian had hidden the truth from me because she knew that if I heard that tape while she was alive, I would have destroyed them immediately, causing a massive family explosion during her final peaceful days. She waited. She allowed me to grieve her passing for a full year. And then she delivered the truth right when I needed it most. I placed my hands on the laptop keyboard. The trap was already set. The walls were already built around them. They had walked directly into the center of the cage. All I had to do now was lock the door and turn off the lights. I was not going to call the police right now. I was not going to stop their flight or have them arrested before they tasted the luxury they were so desperate for. No, I wanted them to land in Dubai. I wanted them to walk into the glittering lobby of their 5-star desert resort smelling of expensive perfume and unearned arrogance. I wanted them to feel like they were on top of the world. And then I was going to cut the cables. I was going to log into this portal and freeze every single credit card in their wallets. I was going to contact my property manager and instantly terminate their penthouse lease for breach of contract, evicting them onto the street. I was going to completely sever the invisible financial umbilical cord that had kept them alive for the past decade. I stared at the screen, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. Let them fly, I whispered to the empty room. Let them enjoy the view from the sky. Because the fall back down to earth is going to break every single bone in their arrogant bodies. I closed my encrypted laptop and locked the heavy steel safe hidden behind the bookshelf in my study. The digital voice recorder and the thick manila folder containing the forged documents were tucked securely into my leather briefcase. I walked out of my house and got back into my unassuming black sedan. It was time to visit my legal team. I drove downtown toward the towering glass and steel structures that dominated the Chicago skyline. I had helped build several of those massive buildings during my long career. I knew the exact weight their steel columns could support. I knew the materials hidden inside their concrete walls. Now I was heading into one of those very skyscrapers to permanently tear down the false reality my son and his wife had built. My destination was the top floor of a highly prestigious commercial building. It housed the offices of Pierce & Associates, which was an elite private wealth management and corporate law firm. I had retained the lead partner Jonathan Pierce over 30 years ago when Vivian and I bought our very first commercial property. Jonathan was a brilliant legal shark in a tailored suit. He handled complex corporate litigation, international trust funds, and federal tax law for high-net-worth clients. He did not normally deal with petty family squabbles, but what my son and his wife had done was no longer a simple family issue. It was a massive and coordinated federal crime. I stepped off the private elevator and walked past the sleek marble reception desk. The receptionist greeted me by name and immediately escorted me to the main conference room at the end of the hall. Jonathan was waiting for me. He was a tall, sharp-featured man with silver hair and a demeanor that commanded absolute respect in any courtroom. He poured me a cup of black coffee and sat across from me at the long mahogany table. He immediately noticed the rigid posture of my shoulders and the cold, dead expression in my eyes. He asked me what was wrong. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. I opened my briefcase and laid the forged medical power of attorney flat on the table. Then I placed the fraudulent bill of sale for the 1969 Mustang right next to it. Finally, I set the small digital voice recorder in the dead center of the mahogany table. I told Jonathan that my 42-year-old son Kendrick and his wife Chloe had forged a medical document claiming I was suffering from severe senility. I told him they used a fake notary stamp to illegally sell my classic car and steal $40,000 to fund a luxury anniversary trip to Dubai. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he carefully examined the forged signatures. His brilliant legal mind immediately began to categorize the felonies. He pointed out the clear evidence of wire fraud, grand theft auto, and felony elder financial abuse. He told me we had them dead to rights. But I told him that was only the beginning. I reached over and pressed the play button on the digital recorder. The silent conference room suddenly filled with the static hiss of the recording, followed by the rhythmic and steady beeping of a heart monitor. Jonathan sat perfectly still as Chloe's vicious voice echoed off the glass walls of the room. He listened to her brutally threaten to withhold pain medication from my dying wife Vivian. He listened to Kendrick, my own flesh and blood, tell his mother to just sign the trust transfer because her money was basically his anyway. When the tape clicked off, the silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment, rubbing his temples. When he opened his eyes, they were filled with a cold, professional fury. He looked at me and stated that this was no longer just a civil matter of stolen property. It was extortion. It was extreme elder abuse. It was a federal nightmare. Jonathan immediately picked up his desk phone and called in two of his senior criminal defense partners. When the two experienced lawyers entered the room and reviewed the forged paperwork and the audio transcript, the consensus among them was unanimous. They told me we needed to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation right this second. They explained that because the stolen funds were wired across state lines and the fraudulent documents crossed federal banking jurisdictions, this was instantly a federal case. The senior criminal lawyer checked his watch. He calculated that Kendrick and Chloe's luxury flight to Dubai was likely still somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. He looked at me and said if we called the federal authorities right now, we could have their flight intercepted. We could have federal agents waiting at the gate when they landed for their connection. Or we could have them arrested by international authorities the exact second their feet touched the ground in the United Arab Emirates. The lawyers were fired up. They wanted to drop the hammer immediately and show absolutely no mercy. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I looked at the three highly paid lawyers sitting across from me, ready to unleash the full force of the United States justice system on my command. I shook my head slowly. No, I told them. My voice was completely calm and devoid of any panic. We are not going to stop their flight. We are not going to have them arrested before they reach their luxurious destination. Jonathan looked at me deeply confused. He reminded me that they had stolen $40,000 and had emotionally tortured my dying wife in her final hours. He said they needed to be placed behind bars immediately before they could spend another dime. I placed my coffee cup down and leaned forward, resting my calloused hands on the polished mahogany table. I explained my reasoning to them using the strict logic of a structural engineer. I told them that if you demolish a building too early, the dust settles too quickly and the impact is minimal. Kendrick and Chloe thought they had won the ultimate prize. They were currently sitting in first class drinking expensive champagne and posting arrogant pictures on social media. They believed they were brilliant, untouchable masterminds who had successfully outsmarted a helpless and senile old black man. Arresting them mid-flight would just be a sudden shock. They would play the victims. They would cry and claim it was a massive misunderstanding. I did not want a simple arrest. I wanted total and complete psychological destruction. I looked Jonathan directly in the eyes. Let them land in Dubai, I said. Let them step off that plane and check into their 5-star luxury desert resort. Let them taste heaven before I drag them down to hell. I want them to feel the absolute peak of arrogance and entitlement before we pull the entire rug out from under them. I want them to realize they are stranded in a foreign desert, completely stripped of their wealth, their power, and their freedom. Jonathan slowly nodded his head. A dark understanding settled over his features. He understood exactly what I was doing. It was a calculated, cold-blooded execution of absolute justice. I told the legal team to proceed with filing the criminal reports, but to do it quietly and entirely behind the scenes. I wanted the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the district attorney fully briefed and armed with every single piece of evidence. I wanted the federal arrest warrants drafted, signed, and waiting silently in the national system. But the warrants were not to be executed in Dubai. They were to be held like a loaded steel spring waiting for the exact moment Kendrick and Chloe returned to American soil. The lawyers immediately went to work. For the next 3 hours, I sat in that conference room as Jonathan and his team drafted the most meticulous and devastating legal complaints I had ever seen. They compiled the forged medical power of attorney, the fake notary stamp, the fraudulent bill of sale, and a certified legal transcript of the hospice audio recording. They contacted a highly specialized unit within the federal authorities that dealt specifically with wire fraud and the exploitation of vulnerable seniors. Because of Jonathan's elite connections in the city, he was able to secure a private meeting with a federal prosecutor that very afternoon. The federal prosecutor was a no-nonsense woman who reviewed the evidence with ruthless efficiency. When she heard the audio recording of Chloe threatening my dying wife, her professional demeanor shifted into deep personal disgust. She assured my legal team that this case would be expedited to the top of her desk. She confirmed that federal arrest warrants for Kendrick Rollins and Chloe Rollins would be officially issued and entered into the National Fugitive Database by sunset. The severe charges would include aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, criminal extortion, and felony elder abuse. The trap was now officially armed. The steel jaws of the federal justice system were locked wide open, just waiting for my son and his wife to step inside. I left the law firm as the sun began to set over the sprawling city of Chicago. The evening sky was painted in deep shades of orange and purple, reflecting off the endless glass skyscrapers I had spent my life building. I got back into my black sedan and looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. Kendrick and Chloe would be landing in Dubai very soon. They would be walking off their luxury flight, breathing in the warm desert air, feeling like absolute royalty. They had no idea that they were now officially federal fugitives. They had no idea that while they were flying thousands of miles away, dreaming of endless wealth, I had spent the entire day quietly dismantling every single financial safety net they had ever known. The blueprint for their destruction was complete and flawless. Now all I had to do was execute the final demolition. The drive back to my house from the law firm was quiet. The evening traffic of Chicago flowed around me like a river of steel and glass, but my mind was entirely focused on the digital architecture of my son's life. I had spent my entire career erecting massive structures. I knew how to build things that would last for generations. But every engineer also knows how to perform a controlled demolition. You do not just blow up a building blindly. You study the load-bearing walls, you cut off the utilities, you weaken the foundation, and then you press the detonator. Kendrick and Chloe were currently flying 7,000 miles away from home, suspended in a steel tube high above the Atlantic Ocean. They were completely unreachable and completely vulnerable. It was the perfect time to drop the financial guillotine. I parked my unassuming black sedan in the driveway and walked back into my empty house. The silence greeted me again, but this time it did not feel like a void. It felt like a blank canvas. I walked straight into my study, locked the heavy oak door, and opened the hidden steel safe behind the bookshelf. I pulled out my encrypted laptop and set it on the solid wooden desk. The glowing screen illuminated my face in the dim room. Before I logged into my private wealth management portal, I decided to check something else. I opened a web browser and navigated to Chloe's public social media page. I knew exactly what I was going to find, but seeing it still made my jaw clench. There was a new picture posted just an hour before their flight took off. It was a selfie of Kendrick and Chloe sitting in the oversized plush seats of a first-class airline cabin. Chloe was holding up a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses inside the airplane and a smug, entitled smile on her face. Kendrick was leaning in next to her wearing a tailored jacket that I had unknowingly paid for. The caption underneath the photo was a masterclass in arrogance. It read, "Leaving the dead weight and all the rust in the past. Off to our Dubai paradise for a VIP anniversary. Upgrades all the way because we deserve the best." I stared at the words, "leaving the dead weight in the past." They were talking about me. They were talking about the classic Mustang they had stolen from my garage. They were talking about the mother who had birthed him and the father who had sheltered him from every storm. They truly believed they had successfully discarded me like a piece of trash. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness looking at that photograph. I only felt the cold, calculated precision of an executioner. They wanted to live in the clouds. I was about to remove the ground from beneath their feet. I closed the social media tab and opened my secure banking portal. I typed in my complex passwords and bypassed the security protocols. The screen loaded, displaying the massive network of trusts, limited liability companies, and holding accounts that Vivian and I had built over 40 years. I navigated to the personal credit division. I pulled up the primary platinum credit card accounts. These were the heavy metal cards that Chloe loved to slam down on restaurant tables to impress her shallow friends. These were the cards with virtually no spending limits. I looked at the pending transactions. There was a charge for $4,000 to the airline for their first-class upgrades. There was a charge for $800 for a luxury car service to the airport. There was a pending authorization for $15,000 to a 5-star desert resort in the United Arab Emirates. They were spending the money they got from selling my car, but they were routing everything through these platinum cards to gather reward points and maintain their wealthy facade. They thought those cards belonged to them because their names were printed on the front. They had completely forgotten, or perhaps they never fully understood, that my primary holding company was the absolute guarantor on every single account. They were authorized users on my empire. I moved my mouse over the master control settings for the credit accounts. I did not just lower their spending limits. That would give them a warning. I did not just pause the accounts. That could be reversed with a phone call to customer service. I selected every single card attached to Kendrick and Chloe. I clicked the option to report the accounts as compromised by severe fraud. I instructed the system to permanently freeze the lines of credit and block all international transactions immediately. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed. The available balances on all their cards dropped to absolute zero. The first cable had been cut. Their endless supply of magical money was gone. When they tried to buy a drink on their layover or pay for a taxi in Dubai, those heavy metal cards would be nothing more than useless pieces of plastic. But I was not done. A controlled demolition requires multiple points of failure. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct number for my lead property manager. He was a ruthless, efficient man who managed my entire portfolio of luxury residential high-rises downtown. He answered on the second ring. "Good evening, Mr. Rollins," the property manager said, his voice respectful and alert. "What can I do for you tonight, sir?" "I need you to pull the lease agreement for Unit 4200, I told him, keeping my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "The penthouse suite." He tapped on his keyboard for a few seconds. "I have it right here, sir. The tenants are Kendrick and Chloe Rollins. We have them listed under your special corporate subsidy program. You are the primary financial guarantor on the lease." "Not anymore," I said. "I am officially revoking my guarantor status, effective immediately due to a discovery of severe financial fraud committed by the tenants. Because their independent income does not meet the minimum requirement for a luxury penthouse, they are now in immediate breach of contract." I heard the property manager stop typing. He understood exactly what was happening. He knew I was evicting my own son. He did not ask any questions. He simply waited for his orders. "I want a 24-hour notice to vacate posted on their door tonight," I commanded. "Send a maintenance crew up there first thing tomorrow morning. I want the digital access codes to the penthouse completely wiped and reprogrammed. I want the physical locks changed. Have a professional moving crew pack all of their remaining personal belongings into black trash bags and move them into the basement storage facility. If they want their things back, they can contact the legal department. They no longer have a home in my building." "Consider it done, Mr. Rollins," the manager replied without hesitation. "The codes will be wiped by midnight. The unit will be secured and empty by noon tomorrow." I ended the call and set the phone down on my desk. The second cable had been cut. Their sanctuary was gone. They had spent years filling that penthouse with expensive furniture, designer clothes, and arrogant memories. Now it was just empty space waiting for a new tenant. Even if they somehow managed to find a way back to Chicago, they would arrive to find themselves locked out on the street with absolutely nowhere to go. They were officially homeless. There was only one final structural support left to destroy. In the modern world, communication is survival. If you are stranded in a foreign country, your cell phone is your only lifeline. It is your map, your bank, your translator, and your only way to call for help. Kendrick and Chloe were addicted to their phones. They lived their entire lives through glowing screens, seeking validation from strangers on the internet. I opened a new tab on my laptop and logged into the master account for our family telecommunications plan. Years ago, when Kendrick was just starting his career, I had set up a comprehensive corporate phone plan to save him some money. I owned the master account, and I paid the bill every single month without ever bringing it up. It was just another invisible safety net I had provided for my son. I looked at the data usage statistics on their lines. Chloe was already using the in-flight wireless network to post more updates and browse her social media feeds. She was completely oblivious to the financial slaughter taking place back home. I navigated to the device management dashboard. I selected the phone numbers belonging to Kendrick and Chloe. I disabled their international roaming capabilities. I turned off their cellular data plans completely, and then just to ensure absolute isolation, I suspended their voice and text messaging services. I effectively turned their $1,000 smartphones into useless glowing bricks. They would not be able to make calls. They would not be able to access their mobile banking apps to see why their cards were declining. They would only be able to use whatever free public wireless networks they could beg for in the airport or hotel lobbies. I clicked Save Changes. The system processed the request and confirmed that the lines were officially disconnected. The final cable had been severed. The controlled demolition was complete. I slowly closed the encrypted laptop. The screen went dark, leaving the study in deep shadows. I leaned back in my leather chair and let out a long, slow breath. For a brief moment, the image of Kendrick as a little boy flashed in my mind. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle in the park. I remembered showing him how to tie his necktie before his high school graduation. I remembered the pride I felt when he got his first job. But then the audio recording of him standing in the hospice room telling his dying mother to just sign away her money pushed those warm memories into the incinerator. The boy I raised was dead. The man who replaced him was a parasite, and I had just eradicated the host. I stood up from my desk, walked over to the small wooden cabinet in the corner of the study, and poured myself a neat glass of aged bourbon. I walked back to the desk and raised the glass toward the empty room. I raised it to Vivian. She was the brilliant architect who had seen this coming. She was the one who had hidden the truth under the passenger seat of her beloved classic car, knowing that her greedy son would eventually try to sell it. She had given me the tools to protect our legacy. I took a slow, burning sip of the bourbon. I looked at the old grandfather clock ticking quietly against the wall. Kendrick and Chloe were still flying high above the world, wrapped in their blankets of arrogance and stolen luxury. But in a few short hours, their airplane would begin its descent into the blazing heat of the Middle East. They would step off that plane expecting red carpets and royal treatment. They would walk up to the customs agents and luxury hotel concierges completely unaware that the world they left behind no longer existed. They were about to land in a strange desert country with no money, no credit, no home to return to, and no way to call for help. They had abandoned me to fund their paradise. Now they were about to discover exactly what it feels like to be completely and utterly stranded. The financial guillotine had dropped, and they had not even felt the blade yet. I sat in the quiet darkness of my study in Chicago with nothing but the soft glow of my encrypted laptop illuminating the room. I was watching the digital logs of my banking portal refresh in real time. But to truly understand the sheer magnitude of the destruction I had just unleashed, you have to picture exactly what was happening 7,000 miles away. You have to imagine the blistering heat of the Arabian desert and the towering glass skyscrapers of Dubai. Kendrick and Chloe were landing in a world built on extreme wealth and absolute rules. They thought they were kings and queens arriving to claim their throne. They had absolutely no idea that I had just turned their royal carriage into a rolling prison. The international flight touched down at the massive Dubai airport. Kendrick and Chloe stepped off the plane wearing their expensive designer clothes that I had unknowingly paid for over the years. They bypassed the regular crowds because they had used the money from my stolen classic car to book an exclusive VIP arrival service. They walked through the pristine terminal, feeling like celebrities. Chloe was holding her phone high in the air, recording videos for her social media followers. She wanted the whole world to see how successful and glamorous she was. Her phone was connected to the free airport wireless network, so the videos uploaded perfectly. She smiled at the camera and boasted about leaving the boring past behind and stepping into a life of pure luxury. A man in a sharp black suit greeted them at the arrival gate, holding a digital tablet with Kendrick Rollins displayed in elegant gold letters. Kendrick nodded at the man with a smug expression, acting as if he had been born into this level of service. The man escorted them through a private exit and led them to a waiting chauffeur-driven white Rolls-Royce. Chloe giggled with delight as the driver opened the heavy door for her. She slid into the plush leather seats and immediately tried to post another video. But as the heavy doors of the Rolls-Royce closed, separating them from the airport signal, her phone lost its connection. She tapped the screen a few times, feeling a slight annoyance when the cellular data symbol did not appear. She assumed it was just a temporary glitch with the international roaming setup. She had no idea that I had completely terminated her data plan from my desk in Chicago. The luxurious car glided down the massive desert highways, heading toward the city center. Kendrick looked out the tinted windows at the towering Burj Khalifa and the endless sprawling wealth of Dubai. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He truly believed he had earned this vacation by outsmarting his old senile father. He thought he had executed a brilliant financial maneuver by selling my 1969 Ford Mustang. He put his arm around his wife and told her this was just the beginning of their new lavish lifestyle. They were completely disconnected from the outside world, but the sheer comfort of the Rolls-Royce kept them blinded to the danger gathering around them. The car finally pulled up to the entrance of an ultra-luxury 5-star resort. It was an architectural marvel, built with imported marble towering golden pillars and cascading waterfalls right in the middle of the desert. 4 porters rushed forward to open the car doors and collect their matching Louis Vuitton luggage. Kendrick stepped out of the car, adjusting his tailored jacket. He handed the driver a small cash tip, feeling like a billionaire. They walked through the massive glass doors and into the breathtaking hotel lobby. The air was cool and smelled of rich spices and expensive flowers. A polite receptionist wearing an immaculate uniform greeted them at the front desk. She welcomed them to the resort and thanked them for choosing the Royal Desert Suite for their anniversary. Kendrick leaned against the marble counter with a casual, arrogant posture. The receptionist typed on her computer and politely informed them that she needed a credit card to keep on file. She explained that it was a standard procedure for all high-end suites and that she would need to place a temporary hold of $15,000 for the room and any incidental expenses during their stay. Kendrick did not even blink at the amount. He reached into his designer wallet and pulled out the heavy metal platinum credit card. It was the card that had funded his entire fake lifestyle for the past 5 years. It was the card that I personally guaranteed with my commercial real estate empire. He placed the metal card onto the marble counter with a loud, satisfying clink. He told the receptionist to put all the charges on that account and to make sure a bottle of vintage champagne was sent to their room immediately. The receptionist smiled warmly and inserted the heavy metal card into the card reader. She waited for the system to process the transaction. A few seconds passed. The machine let out a sharp, low beep. The receptionist looked at her computer screen and a small frown briefly crossed her face. She quickly composed herself and looked back at Kendrick. She apologized softly and told him that the card had been declined. Kendrick let out a short, condescending laugh. He told the receptionist that her machine must be broken. He explained that it was an unlimited platinum account and that there must just be a simple security flag because he was traveling internationally. He told her to run it again and push it through. The receptionist maintained her professional smile and tried the transaction a second time. She manually typed in the numbers and waited. The machine beeped again. A bright red error message flashed on her screen stating that the account was frozen due to severe fraud and that the merchant should not honor the card under any circumstances. She looked up at Kendrick and her tone became slightly more serious. She informed him that the bank had completely blocked the transaction and that the card was reading as permanently suspended. Kendrick felt a sudden flush of heat in his cheeks. A few wealthy guests standing nearby in the lobby turned their heads to look at the commotion. Kendrick hated being embarrassed in public. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, intending to call the bank and yell at a customer service representative. But when he looked at his screen, he saw that he had zero signal. There was no cellular network. There was no roaming. His phone was a dead piece of glass and metal. Chloe saw her husband struggling and rolled her eyes. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh meant to show the entire lobby how inconvenienced she was. She opened her purse and pulled out her own matching platinum card. She told the receptionist not to worry about her husband and to just use her card instead. Chloe boasted that they had plenty of funds and told the clerk to hurry up because they had a private desert safari to prepare for. The receptionist took Chloe's card and inserted it into the machine. Chloe leaned against the counter, tapping her manicured nails on the marble, completely confident that her card would work. The machine processed the request. It beeped the exact same low, sharp tone. The receptionist looked at the screen and saw the exact same fraud warning. The account was permanently frozen. The funds were gone. The atmosphere at this front desk instantly shifted. The polite, welcoming smiles of the hotel staff vanished. The receptionist took a step back from the counter and quietly pressed a button under her desk. She told Chloe that her card had also been declined and that both accounts were returning severe fraud alerts from the issuing bank in the United States. Panic finally began to claw its way into Kendrick's chest. He frantically tapped the screen of his dead cell phone, trying to find a wireless network. Chloe snatched her card back from the counter and demanded to know what was going on. Her voice was shrill and panicky. She told the receptionist they had just flown first class and had plenty of money. She demanded to speak to the manager immediately. The hotel manager was already walking toward them. He was a tall, imposing man dressed in a flawless dark suit. He approached the desk with 2 large security guards walking silently behind him. The manager did not smile. He looked at the computer screen, verified the fraud alerts, and then turned his cold gaze toward Kendrick and Chloe. He spoke in perfect, clear English. He informed them that their payment methods were invalid and that they had already incurred charges for the luxury airport transfer service. He explained that in the United Arab Emirates, financial fraud and the inability to pay debts are not treated as simple civil matters like they are in America. In Dubai, passing bad checks or attempting to use frozen credit accounts to secure luxury services is a strict criminal offense. He told them that people go to prison for a very long time for exactly what they were doing right now. Kendrick felt his knees grow weak, the blood completely drained from his face. He tried to explain that it was just a banking error and that his father was a wealthy engineer who would fix it. He practically begged the manager to let them use the lobby telephone to call home. But the manager shook his head. He told Kendrick that until the $15,000 deposit and the transportation fees were paid in full in cash, they were considered a severe flight risk. The manager delivered the final crushing blow with absolute professional detachment. He calmly instructed his security guards to step forward. He told Kendrick and Chloe that hotel protocol for this specific situation required the immediate confiscation of their passports as collateral. He explained that if they could not produce the required funds within 24 hours, he would be forced to contact the local police and report them for financial fraud. Chloe began to hyperventilate. She screamed that they could not take her passport and that she was an American citizen. One of the security guards stepped closer to her, invading her personal space just enough to silence her. The guard held out his hand. Kendrick, trembling and covered in a cold sweat, slowly reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out their 2 blue American passports and handed them over to the manager. The manager took the passports and placed them in his breast pocket. He told them they were not allowed to check into the suite. He told them they were not allowed to use any of the resort facilities. They were effectively stranded in the massive marble lobby surrounded by wealth they could no longer touch. They had no money. They had no working cell phones. They had no passports. They were trapped in a foreign desert 7,000 miles away from home, facing the very real threat of a harsh foreign prison. The financial guillotine I had built in Chicago had dropped, perfectly isolating them in a nightmare they created entirely by themselves. I sat in my study watching the security alerts from the credit card company confirm the declined transactions in Dubai. I could picture the exact look of horror on my son's face. He had spent his entire adult life acting like he was superior to the man who raised him. He thought his mother's legacy was just a tool to fund his arrogance. Now he was standing in the sweltering heat of the Middle East, completely stripped of his fake armor. He was about to learn the most painful lesson of his miserable life. And the best part was that I did not have to lift a single finger to hurt him. I just stopped protecting him. I just let the real world handle him. The trap was locked and there was no way out. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. It was 3 a.m. in Chicago. The city outside my window was completely asleep, wrapped in the cold, dark embrace of the early morning. But I was wide awake. I sat in my heavy leather armchair in the study with the lights turned off. The only illumination came from the street lamps outside, casting long shadows across the walls of my home. In my right hand, I held a heavy crystal glass filled with aged bourbon. It was a very specific bottle. Vivian had bought it for my 60th birthday. She told me to save it for a moment of absolute triumph. Tonight felt like the right time to finally open it. I took a slow sip. The liquid burned pleasantly as it went down, warming my chest. I stared at the blank screen of my cell phone resting on the wooden desk. I knew the exact flight schedules. I knew the distance between the Dubai International Airport and the luxury resort they had booked. I had calculated the time it would take for them to get through customs, retrieve their designer luggage, and take their chauffeur-driven car to the hotel. According to my mental timeline, they were currently standing at the reception desk. They were currently realizing that their unlimited platinum cards were nothing but useless pieces of plastic. I knew that panic was setting in right at this very second. I did not feel tired. The adrenaline of pure justice was keeping me sharp. I thought about the sheer arrogance it took for my son Kendrick to stand in my living room and call me a useless old man. I thought about the cruel smirk on Chloe's face when she bragged about forging my signature on a medical power of attorney. They thought they could strip me of my dignity and my assets and then fly away to a desert paradise without looking back. They thought I would just sit in this house and quietly fade away into the fog of old age. But I am an engineer. When I find a flaw in a structure, I do not ignore it. I tear the structure down to the ground. Suddenly, the silence of the study was broken. My cell phone began to vibrate against the hard wooden surface of the desk. The screen lit up, casting a bright bluish glow across the room. It was an incoming voice call on a mobile internet application. Normal cellular service was impossible because I had completely terminated their international roaming and data plans. Kendrick had clearly managed to connect his useless phone to the free wireless internet in the hotel lobby. He was calling me. I did not pick up the phone immediately. I let it ring. I watched the screen vibrate and slide slightly across the polished wood. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to feel the absolute terror of the unknown. The phone stopped ringing. The screen went dark. The room returned to silence. I took another slow sip of my bourbon, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. 10 seconds later, the phone lit up and started vibrating again. He was desperate. He was thousands of miles away, trapped in a foreign country with no money, no passport, and a hotel manager threatening to call the police. He needed his father to save him. I reached out and picked up the phone. I pressed the green button to accept the call and brought the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened to the chaotic sounds coming from the other side of the world. Dad, Kendrick shouted. His voice was frantic, breathless, and trembling with an absolute panic I had never heard from him before. Dad, please tell me you are there. Please answer me. I remained completely silent for another 3 seconds, letting him drown in his own anxiety. Then I spoke, keeping my voice incredibly calm and flat. I am here, Kendrick, I said. It is 3 o'clock in the morning in Chicago. Why are you waking me up? Dad, listen to me. You have to help us. Kendrick stammered, his words rushing out in a desperate flood. Something is wrong with the bank. Something is terribly wrong. We just got to the resort in Dubai, and they tried to run the platinum cards for the room deposit. Both cards were declined, Dad. The machine said the accounts are frozen for severe fraud. I tried to call the bank, but my cell service is completely dead. I do not have any data. I am using the lobby internet to call you. You have to call the bank right now and tell them to authorize the charges. I took another sip of bourbon. I could hear the faint sound of Chloe crying in the background. Her usual arrogant tone was completely gone, replaced by the high-pitched sobs of a spoiled child who had just dropped her ice cream. Kendrick continued speaking, his voice cracking. Dad, they took our passports. The hotel manager confiscated our passports because we cannot pay the $15,000 hold for the suite. We also owe the private driver. In this country, it is a strict criminal offense to bounce a payment. The manager is standing right over there with 2 massive security guards. He said if we do not produce the cash or a working credit card in the next few hours, he is going to call the local police. They are going to arrest us, Dad. They are going to throw us in a Dubai prison for financial fraud. You have to log into your account and wire $20,000 to the hotel right this second. Please, Dad, you have to save us. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the dark walls of my study. I pictured my 42-year-old son standing in that glittering marble lobby, sweating through his expensive tailored shirt, begging for his life. He was not asking me to save him because he loved me. He was asking me to save him because I was his personal automated teller machine. I was just a resource to be exploited whenever he got himself into trouble. Kendrick, I said, my voice dropping to a low, cold whisper. Do you remember what you told me yesterday morning when you were packing your bags in my living room? There was a brief pause on the line. What? Kendrick asked, his voice shaking with confusion. Dad, what are you talking about? We do not have time for this. The police are going to be here soon. Please just wire the $20,000. I will pay you back, I swear. Just call the bank. You stood in my house, I continued, ignoring his pleas. You stood in the home I paid for, and you told me that my wife's classic car was just a pile of rust. You told me that I should get over it because you needed the money for a luxury vacation. And then your wife told me that she forged a medical document claiming I was suffering from severe mental decline. You laughed at me, Kendrick. You called me an old man, and you told me I was no longer capable of making my own financial decisions. Dad, please, Kendrick begged. He was openly crying now. I am sorry. I am so sorry about the car. I will buy it back for you. Just please send the wire transfer. Chloe is terrified. We cannot go to prison in the Middle East. You are my father. You have to help me. I slowly swirled the bourbon in my glass, listening to the ice clink against the crystal. The sound was incredibly satisfying. I felt the presence of my late wife, Vivian, in the room with me. I knew she was watching this exact moment. I knew she was proud of the man I had become. Wire money. I asked, my tone shifting to an exaggerated, confused drawl, mimicking the very condition they had accused me of having. Kendrick, I cannot do that. Do you not remember what the doctor said? What are you doing? Dad? Kendrick sobbed, his panic reaching a fever pitch. "What, doctor? Please stop playing around." "The doctor whose note you used to steal my car," I replied, the coldness returning to my voice sharper than before. "That doctor said I am senile. I am just a confused, helpless old black man losing his mind." A senile old man does not know how to log into a complex commercial banking portal. A senile old man certainly does not know how to execute a highly secure international wire transfer for $20,000 to the United Arab Emirates. My brain is just too far gone for that kind of technology. The realization finally hit him. I could hear the exact moment his world completely shattered. The silence on his end of the phone was absolute. He realized that this was not a banking error. He realized that I had orchestrated this entire nightmare. He realized that the father he had underestimated his entire life was the architect of his total destruction. "You froze the accounts," Kendrick whispered, his voice hollow and completely defeated. "You turned off the phones. You did this to us." "I did not do anything to you, Kendrick," I stated calmly. "You forged federal documents. You stole from a dying woman. You sold my memories for a plane ticket. You built a house out of paper and you lit the match yourself. I just decided to stop shielding you from the fire." "Dad, please no," Kendrick screamed. The facade was gone. It was just raw, primal terror. "You cannot leave us here. We will die here. Please, I am your son. I am your only son. You stopped being my son the day you watched your wife threaten to cut off your mother's pain medication and did absolutely nothing to stop her," I said. Chloe started screaming in the background. "Give me the phone," she shrieked, her voice filled with desperate rage. "Dexter, you cannot do this to me. I am an American citizen. I will call the embassy. I will have you arrested for stranding us." I took one final sip of my bourbon. The liquid was perfectly smooth. "Enjoy your vacation in paradise," I said, speaking directly into the microphone. "I hear the desert gets very cold at night. Try to stay warm." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. The chaotic screaming of my son and his wife was instantly cut off, replaced by the deep, comforting silence of my study. I navigated to the settings menu on my phone and permanently blocked the number. They would not be able to call me again. They would not be able to leave voicemails or send messages. They were entirely cut off from my world. I placed the phone face down on the wooden desk. I finished the rest of my bourbon in one long, satisfying swallow. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the quarter hour. It was a beautiful sound. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The trap had not just closed around them, it had locked permanently. They were stranded 7,000 miles away with no money, no passports, and no hope of rescue. They would face the ruthless consequences of the law in a foreign land, and when they finally managed to crawl back to the United States, the federal agents would be waiting to finish the job. I had successfully demolished the rotten foundation. The demolition was perfect. I sat in the darkness feeling absolutely no regret. I only felt peace. I sat in the quiet comfort of my study in Chicago, surrounded by the cool air conditioning and the deep silence of my home. 7,000 miles away, the sun was rising over the Arabian desert, baking the city of Dubai in 110-degree heat. I did not need to be there to see exactly what was happening. I had engineered this collapse so perfectly that I could picture every single miserable second of their downfall. The luxury resort manager had given them a stark ultimatum. He kept their 2 blue American passports locked in his safe. He told them they had exactly 12 hours to produce the cash to cover the airport transfer fees and the cancellation penalties. If they failed, he would hand the matter over to the local authorities. In that country, financial fraud is not met with a slap on the wrist. It is met with a cold, concrete cell. The security guards escorted my 42-year-old son and his entitled wife out of the pristine, air-conditioned lobby. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind them, locking them out of paradise. The heat hit them instantly like a physical blow. The morning sun in the desert is unforgiving. It beats down on the pavement and radiates upward, suffocating anyone who is not prepared for it. Kendrick was wearing a heavy tailored suit jacket. Chloe was wearing a delicate designer silk dress and high heels meant for walking on marble floors, not blistering concrete. They stood on the sidewalk dragging their matching luxury suitcases, entirely abandoned by the world. For years, their marriage had been held together by a fragile web of my money. I paid the rent for their luxury penthouse. I paid the credit card bills that funded their lavish dinners. Without my financial protection, there was nothing left to mask the ugly reality of their relationship. The illusion was gone, and the toxicity immediately boiled over. They dragged their heavy luggage down the perfectly paved street, looking for shade that did not exist. The wheels of their expensive suitcases rattled loudly against the concrete. Sweat began to pour down Kendrick's face, soaking through his expensive collar. Chloe's perfect hair was ruined by the stifling humidity, and her heavy makeup began to melt down her cheeks. The physical discomfort broke whatever patience she had left. She stopped walking, dropping the handle of her bag, and turned on my son. She started screaming right there on the sidewalk, not caring who heard her. She called him a worthless, broke loser. She yelled that he had promised her a lifestyle of royalty, but instead he had dragged her to a foreign desert to be treated like a criminal. She blamed him for everything. She told him he was not half the man his father was, because at least his father knew how to keep a roof over their heads. Kendrick had spent his entire adult life bowing to her demands, trying to buy her affection. But the panic and the heat finally snapped his temper. He dropped his bags and yelled back at her. The facade of the perfect wealthy couple completely shattered. He pointed his finger in her face and reminded her whose idea this trip was in the first place. He screamed that she was the one who forged the medical power of attorney. He reminded her that she was the one who bought the fake notary stamp online to sell my car. He told her that if they went to federal prison, it would be because of her sloppy forgery. The reality of their crimes echoed loudly in the hot desert air. They were no longer a glamorous couple living the high life. They were two desperate, cornered criminals turning on each other like trapped rats. They realized in that moment that they had absolutely no one else to blame but themselves. The safety net was gone and the ground was rushing up to meet them. They stood on the street corner, panting and sweating, realizing that screaming would not get their passports back. They had no working cell phones to call for help. They had no credit cards to book a return flight. They had empty pockets and a ticking clock. If they did not return to the hotel with the cash before the sun went down, they would be arrested. The fear of a foreign prison finally overrode their anger at each other. They needed cash immediately. They could not go to a standard bank or an automated teller machine. They needed something fast and unofficial. They flagged down a passing taxi. Kendrick had to beg the driver to take them, promising to pay him by selling a piece of jewelry. The driver looked at their sweaty, disheveled designer clothes and reluctantly agreed. He drove them away from the towering modern skyscrapers and the luxury shopping malls. He took them deep into the older, less glamorous parts of the city. He dropped them off in a bustling, crowded district known for its dense maze of gold markets and small, independent trading shops. The contrast was staggering. They had flown thousands of miles expecting private pools and room service. Now they were wandering through a chaotic, hot, dusty market surrounded by shouting vendors and harsh neon signs. They dragged their heavy designer luggage through the narrow alleys. The wheels of the bags caught on the uneven pavement. Their feet were blistered and their clothes were drenched in sweat. They looked like refugees fleeing a disaster. They finally found a small, dingy pawn shop tucked away in a dark corner of the market. The windows were covered in heavy iron bars, and the inside of the shop was cramped and smelled of old dust and cheap incense. A stern-looking man sat behind a thick pane of bulletproof glass, examining pieces of gold with a jeweler's magnifying glass. He looked up as Kendrick and Chloe stumbled into his shop. He saw two desperate, sweating Americans dragging expensive luggage. He knew exactly what kind of people they were. He knew they were desperate, and he knew he held all the power. Kendrick approached the thick glass and took off his watch. It was a solid gold Rolex. I had bought him that watch 5 years ago to celebrate a promotion he barely earned. He pushed it through the small slot under the glass. He told the shop owner it was worth over $20,000. The owner picked it up, examined it for a few seconds, and offered him $3,000 in local currency. Kendrick tried to argue. He tried to raise his voice and demand a fair price, but the shop owner simply slid the watch back across the counter and told him to leave. The owner knew they had no leverage. Kendrick swallowed his pride and pushed the watch back, offering to take the deal. He had to surrender his dignity for pennies on the dollar. But $3,000 was not enough. They needed to pay the hotel, and they needed to buy 2 international flights back to the United States. Chloe stepped forward, her hands shaking. She took off her diamond engagement ring and her diamond wedding band. These were rings that Kendrick had bought using the money he secretly funneled from my corporate accounts. She pushed the sparkling diamonds through the slot. She was sobbing now. The reality of her situation was fully breaking her spirit. She was trading the very symbols of her fake wealth just to avoid going to jail. The shop owner examined the diamonds and offered her another $4,000. Chloe cried and begged for more, but the man remained completely silent and unmoving. She nodded her head, accepting the humiliating deal. They still needed more cash for the flights. Chloe looked down at her matching set of expensive suitcases, the bags she had proudly paraded through the airport just a day ago. She unzipped them right there on the dirty floor of the pawn shop. She pulled out her expensive silk dresses, her designer shoes, and Kendrick's tailored suits. She stuffed their clothing into cheap, thin plastic garbage bags the shop owner tossed over the counter. Then she pushed the empty luxury suitcases through the slot. The owner gave them a few $100s for the luggage. They walked out of the dark pawn shop back into the blinding heat of the desert sun. They were holding a small stack of local currency. Kendrick no longer had his gold watch. Chloe no longer had her diamonds. They were carrying their wrinkled, sweaty clothes in cheap black garbage bags. The glamorous facade was completely stripped away. They had traded their entire identity just to buy a miserable ticket back to reality. They had to walk back to the hotel, pay the angry manager, and retrieve their passports. And then they had to go back to the airport to beg for the cheapest, longest economy flights back to New York. They were completely defeated, physically exhausted, and emotionally destroyed. They had nothing left but the bitter realization that they had brought this entirely upon themselves. And the beautiful part was that they still did not know the worst was yet to come. They thought the nightmare was ending. They did not know that my federal trap was waiting for them at the finish line. I sat in the quiet comfort of my study, sipping the last drops of my bourbon. 7,000 miles away, my son and his wife were living through a self-inflicted nightmare. They had walked out of a dusty pawn shop in the worst part of Dubai, carrying their designer clothes in cheap black garbage bags. They had traded their dignity, their wedding rings, and their expensive watches just to survive. Now they had to make the long, humiliating walk back to the five-star resort to face the hotel manager. I could picture Kendrick sweating through his ruined tailored shirt, clutching a wad of local currency in his shaking hands. The blazing desert sun was unforgiving, punishing them for every step they took on the burning concrete. They walked through the glittering marble doors of the hotel, looking like common beggars. The wealthy guests in the lobby turned their heads to stare at them in absolute disgust. Chloe tried to hide her face behind her messy blonde hair, completely stripped of her usual arrogance. They approached the front desk and dropped the crumpled bills onto the polished stone counter. The hotel manager looked at the money with complete contempt. He counted the bills slowly, deliberately, letting them feel the heavy weight of their humiliation. When he was satisfied, he reached into his safe and tossed their 2 blue American passports onto the counter. He did not say thank you. He simply told his security guards to escort them off the property immediately. They were thrown out onto the blistering street without a backward glance. They managed to find a cheap taxi to take them to the international airport. The ride was silent and suffocating. The air conditioning in the old car was broken, and the smell of exhaust fumes filled the cabin. When they finally arrived at the massive airport terminal, they rushed to the ticketing counters, desperate to escape the country. Kendrick approached the agent and asked for 2 seats on the next flight to Chicago or New York. The ticketing agent typed on her computer and gave him the price for a direct flight. Kendrick looked at the small pile of cash he had left over from the pawn shop. It was not nearly enough. They could not afford a direct flight. They could not afford comfort or dignity. Kendrick had to swallow his pride once again. He asked the agent for the absolute cheapest tickets available to New York. The agent clicked her keys and printed out 2 boarding passes. She handed them over with a look of pity. The itinerary was brutal. It was a miserable economy-class route with 3 separate layovers in different countries. The total travel time was going to be over 48 hours. They had no access to the luxury airport lounges. They had no priority boarding. They took their tickets and dragged their garbage bags of clothing toward the massive public waiting area to begin their punishment. The reality of their situation fully settled in as they walked through the endless airport concourse. A few days ago, they were sipping expensive champagne in first class, laughing about how they had outsmarted a senile old black man. Now they were wandering through the terminal looking for a place to rest their aching bodies. They found a row of hard plastic chairs near a crowded boarding gate. Kendrick slumped into a chair, dropping his garbage bag on the floor. Chloe sat next to him, her face pale and exhausted. The hours began to crawl by at an agonizing pace. The airport was freezing cold, but they had sold their heavy coats to the pawn shop owner. Their stomachs began to rumble, but they had to count every single coin they had left just to survive the journey. Kendrick walked over to a brightly lit vending machine in the corner of the terminal. He fed a few coins into the slot and bought 2 stale prepackaged sandwiches and a single bottle of water. He brought the pathetic meal back to the plastic chairs. Chloe looked at the cold sandwich wrapped in cheap plastic. She thought about the gourmet steaks and fine wine she had planned to eat on this vacation. She tore open the plastic and ate the stale bread in absolute silence, holding back tears of bitter regret. I knew exactly how an airport terminal feels when you are trapped there for 2 days. The fluorescent lights never turn off. The announcements echo through the speakers every 10 minutes, making sleep completely impossible. Kendrick and Chloe spent 48 brutal hours living in those hard plastic chairs. Their bodies ached and their muscles cramped. They smelled of stale sweat, exhaustion, and profound failure. Kendrick looked at his hands. Without his heavy gold watch, his wrist looked bare and weak. Chloe kept touching her finger where her massive diamond engagement ring used to be. The empty space on her hand was a constant reminder of how far they had fallen. They took turns sleeping, using their garbage bags full of wrinkled clothes as pillows. People walking past them gave them wide berths, treating them like vagrants. The glamour was completely dead. The illusion of wealth was entirely shattered. They were stripped down to their absolute lowest core. And in that dark, miserable space, the final threads of their toxic marriage began to snap. It happened during their second sleepless night in the terminal. The exhaustion finally broke Chloe. She sat up from her plastic chair and looked at Kendrick with a cold, vicious hatred. She did not whisper. She wanted him to hear every single word. She told him that he was a pathetic, broke failure. She told him that she only married him because she thought he had a guaranteed inheritance from a wealthy father. She screamed that he could not even steal a car properly without ruining their lives. Kendrick stared at her, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. He had spent years buying her designer bags and expensive dinners, trying to prove he was a successful man. He had betrayed his own dying mother just to keep this woman happy. And now, sitting in a freezing airport terminal smelling of sweat and dirty clothes, she was throwing him away like garbage. Chloe leaned in close to his face and delivered the final blow. She told him that the very second their plane landed in New York, she was calling a lawyer. She promised to divorce him and leave him with absolutely nothing. She told him she never wanted to see his face again once they touched American soil. Kendrick did not argue back. He did not yell. He just sat there looking down at the scuffed floor of the airport. The absolute weight of his decisions crushed him. He realized in that exact moment that he had lost everything. He had lost his beautiful home in the sky because I evicted him. He had lost his endless supply of money because I froze the accounts. He had lost his pride in the dirty pawn shop. And now he had lost the wife he had sacrificed his own soul to please. He was a 42-year-old man with no money, no home, no family, and no future. He was completely broken. He closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands, wishing he could turn back time. He wished he had never sold that cherry-red Mustang. He wished he had never listened to Chloe when she suggested faking my medical records. But regret is a useless emotion when the damage is already done. He had made his choices, and now he had to live in the ruins of his own life. I closed my eyes in my quiet Chicago home and pictured them finally boarding that cramped economy flight to New York. They were sitting in the very last row near the bathroom, squeezed between crying children and exhausted travelers. They thought the worst part of their nightmare was over. They thought that if they just suffered through this long, miserable flight, they could eventually start picking up the pieces of their broken lives. They believed that landing at the John F. Kennedy Airport would be the end of their punishment. They were so incredibly foolish. They had absolutely no idea what I had prepared for them. They did not know that my high-powered legal team had delivered the forged documents and the audio recordings to the federal authorities. They did not know that the federal prosecutor had already signed the warrants for their arrest. As their plane flew through the dark sky heading back toward the United States, they were completely oblivious to the fact that their punishment had not even truly begun. They thought they were flying home to freedom. They did not know that a team of federal agents was already standing at the arrival gate, waiting to lock them in chains the exact second they stepped off the plane. I smiled in the darkness of my study. The foundation had been completely demolished. Now it was time to clear away the rubble. I sat in the quiet comfort of my study in Chicago, watching a digital flight tracker move slowly across my laptop screen. The small airplane icon was just crossing the eastern seaboard of the United States, beginning its final descent into New York. For the past 48 hours, my son Kendrick and his wife Chloe had been trapped in a flying metal tube. They had endured 3 grueling layovers in crowded, noisy international airports. They had slept on uncomfortable seats surrounded by crying infants and exhausted travelers. They had eaten stale, packaged food because they could not afford anything else. They had traded their luxury life for a desperate, miserable crawlback to reality. I knew exactly how their bodies felt right now. Their muscles were cramped and aching from sitting in the cheapest economy seats at the very back of the plane near the lavatories. Their designer clothes, once a symbol of their immense arrogance, were now wrinkled, stained with sweat, and smelling of profound defeat. They truly believed that the absolute worst part of their nightmare was finally coming to an end. As they looked out the small scratched window of the airplane and saw the sprawling skyline of New York City, they felt a tiny spark of relief. They believed that once the wheels touched the tarmac at the John F. Kennedy International Airport, they would be safe. They thought they could just hail a cheap taxi, drag their black plastic garbage bags full of clothes back to their luxury penthouse and hide from the world. They planned to take hot showers, sleep in their expensive bed, and try to figure out how to recover from the disaster in Dubai. Chloe had already decided she was going to contact a divorce lawyer the very next morning. Kendrick was desperately hoping he could somehow call me and beg for forgiveness, assuming I would eventually soften and turn his credit cards back on. They were clinging to the ghost of a life that no longer existed. They had absolutely no idea that while they were suffering in the sky, I had completely erased their sanctuary on the ground. They did not know that the locks on their penthouse had been changed and that their remaining belongings had been tossed into a basement storage facility. But more importantly, they did not know about the welcoming committee I had arranged for them at the airport. The heavy wheels of the commercial airliner hit the runway with a loud screech, bouncing slightly before settling onto the concrete. Kendrick and Chloe unbuckled their seatbelts with trembling hands. They did not have the privilege of walking off the plane first. They had to wait agonizingly long minutes while the first class and business class passengers disembarked. The very same passengers they used to look down upon were now walking past them. Finally, it was their turn to shuffle down the narrow aisle. They stepped out of the aircraft and into the brightly lit terminal. The fluorescent lights of the airport were harsh and unforgiving, highlighting the dark, heavy circles under their eyes and their pale, exhausted faces. They walked through the long, endless corridors of the International Arrivals Building. They handed their blue American passports to the customs agents, answering the standard questions with dry throats and nervous voices. The agents stamped their documents and waved them through, unaware of the federal alerts hovering just below the surface of the computer system. The federal authorities knew exactly what they were doing. They never arrest fugitives at the customs desk if they can avoid it because it causes unnecessary panic and bottlenecks in the secure zones. They prefer to let the targets walk out into the open public spaces where the tactical teams have total control over the environment. Kendrick and Chloe pushed their way through the swinging glass doors and entered the massive, bustling baggage claim area. The terminal was packed with hundreds of people waiting for their luggage, holding up signs and greeting their families. The noise was a chaotic blend of rolling suitcases, overlapping conversations, and loud announcements over the public address system. Kendrick and Chloe found the carousel designated for their flight. They stood slightly apart from each other, not speaking a single word. The toxic resentment between them had frozen into a bitter, silent wall. They just stared at the metal conveyor belt, waiting for their cheap black garbage bags to appear so they could finally leave this miserable place. They felt completely invisible in the massive crowd, but they were the center of attention for a very specific group of people. Federal agents do not move like regular police officers. They do not run or shout to announce their presence. They move with a cold, terrifying precision. They are wolves circling their prey in the middle of a crowded forest. Through the dense throng of weary travelers, 4 tall men wearing dark windbreakers stepped forward. They moved in perfect synchronization, cutting through the crowd like a knife through water. The large, bold yellow letters printed on the back of their jackets spelled out the 3 most terrifying letters in the American justice system: FBI. The crowd of civilians instinctively parted, sensing the heavy authority radiating from the 4 men. Conversations around the baggage carousel suddenly stopped. People took a step back, pulling their children close, watching the dark figures converge on a single point. Kendrick happened to look up from the conveyor belt. He saw the 4 men walking directly toward him. His exhausted brain struggled to process the image. For a brief, foolish second, he thought they were walking past him to grab a dangerous criminal hiding somewhere in the crowd. But the lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern, uncompromising face, locked eyes directly with Kendrick. The agent did not break his gaze. He marched straight up to my son, stopping less than 2 feet away. The other three agents immediately flanked them, forming an inescapable human wall around Kendrick and Chloe. Chloe finally looked up from the floor. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she saw the federal badges clipped to the agents' belts. Her mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming presence of law enforcement. The lead agent spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried over the noise of the baggage carousel, ensuring that every single person in the immediate vicinity could hear him clearly. Kendrick Rollins and Chloe Rollins, the agent announced, projecting his authority like a physical weapon. You are both under arrest. Kendrick felt the last remaining strength leave his legs. He swayed slightly, raising his hands in a weak defensive gesture. He tried to speak to ask if there had been some sort of mistake, but his throat was completely dry. He could only stare at the gold badge gleaming under the harsh airport lights. The agent did not give them a moment to breathe. He continued speaking, listing their crimes with absolute ruthless clarity. You are being charged with severe felony identity theft, federal wire fraud across state and international lines, and felony elder financial abuse. The words echoed through the crowded terminal. Identity theft, wire fraud, elder abuse. The passengers standing nearby gasped, covering their mouths and whispering to each other. Dozens of people pulled out their cell phones and began recording the entire confrontation. Kendrick and Chloe, the couple who had spent years obsessing over their pristine public image, were now the main attraction in a humiliating public spectacle. Kendrick simply dropped his head in total defeat. The reality of the situation crushed him. He realized that I had not just frozen his credit cards. I had handed his entire life over to the federal government. He slowly turned around and placed his hands behind his back, offering absolutely no resistance. He knew it was over. He knew the old man he had mocked and discarded had engineered his complete destruction. But Chloe did not surrender quietly. The sheer entitlement that had fueled her entire existence suddenly erupted into absolute hysteria. She could not comprehend that she was facing actual consequences for her actions. She had always manipulated her way out of trouble. She refused to believe that her glamorous life was ending in a dirty airport terminal. She took a step back, shaking her head violently. No, she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. No, this is a mistake. You cannot arrest me. I did not do anything wrong. It was him. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Kendrick, throwing her own husband to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. He did it, she yelled hysterically. He made me sign those papers. He stole the car. I am a victim here. You cannot do this to me. I want my lawyer. One of the federal agents stepped forward and firmly grasped Chloe by the arm. She let out a wild screech and tried to yank her arm away, thrashing her body in a desperate attempt to break free. She kicked her feet and screamed that they were ruining her life, but federal agents do not tolerate resistance. The agent swiftly twisted her arm behind her back, applying a professional submission hold that instantly neutralized her struggling. He pushed her firmly against the metal edge of the baggage carousel, forcing her to stand still. Chloe sobbed uncontrollably, her tears mixing with the melted makeup on her face. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of her designer diamonds and her fake arrogance. She was just a desperate criminal facing the cold, hard floor of reality. The heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed sharply over the noise of the terminal. It was a beautiful, definitive sound. Click, click. The steel jaws locked securely around Kendrick's wrists. Click, click. The metal clamped down tightly on Chloe's wrists, pulling her arms uncomfortably behind her back. The lead agent began to recite their Miranda rights in a steady, practiced rhythm. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Kendrick closed his eyes tightly as the agent spoke. The heavy steel chains cut into his skin, a constant physical reminder of his absolute failure. He and his wife were paraded through the crowded airport terminal, surrounded by armed federal agents. Hundreds of strangers watched them take the ultimate walk of shame. The flashes of cell phone cameras lit up their path, capturing their disgrace for the entire world to see. They were leaving the airport, but they were not going to their luxury penthouse. They were going to the cold concrete holding cells of a federal detention center. Sitting in my study thousands of miles away, I looked at the digital clock on my desk. The timing was perfect. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling the tension leave my shoulders. The trap had snapped shut with absolute perfection. I had protected my legacy. I had honored the memory of my late wife. I had proven that a quiet, retired engineer should never, ever be underestimated. The demolition was a total success. I walked out into the bright Chicago sunlight, leaving them behind in the dark forever. The foundation was clear. It was time to build something new. The morning after the federal trial felt fundamentally different than any morning I had experienced in the past 40 years. I woke up just as the sun was beginning to rise over the city of Chicago. The light filtering through my bedroom window was soft and golden, casting long, warm shadows across the wooden floor. I lay in bed for a few minutes, simply listening to the absolute silence of my house. For an entire year since my beautiful wife Vivian passed away, the silence in this house had been heavy. It had been filled with grief and the lingering anxiety of waiting for my son Kendrick to ask for another financial bailout. But today the silence was no longer a burden. It was a blank canvas. It was the sound of complete and total freedom. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a pot of strong black coffee. I poured a cup and stood by the window watching the neighborhood wake up. I am Dexter Rollins, a 75-year-old African-American man who spent his life building skyscrapers from the ground up. I had spent decades laying concrete and welding steel, always believing that I was building a legacy for my family. I had poured every ounce of my energy into ensuring that Kendrick would never have to struggle the way I did. But the events of the past few months had taught me a brutal and necessary lesson. You cannot build a strong structure on a rotten foundation. Kendrick and his wife Chloe had proven themselves to be nothing more than parasites feeding on the hard work of others. Now they were locked away in federal prison, paying the price for their unimaginable greed and cruelty. The demolition was over. The dust had finally settled. But a master engineer knows that once a condemned building is torn down, you cannot just leave the empty lot to gather weeds. You have to clear the debris and build something new. You have to repurpose the ground. I finished my coffee and put on a tailored gray suit. I picked up my keys and walked out to my unassuming black sedan. I had a final piece of business to attend to. I drove away from my quiet suburban neighborhood and headed straight toward the towering glass and steel structures of the downtown financial district. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of the luxury high-rise building owned by my primary holding company. I took the private elevator all the way up to the top floor. I stepped out into the quiet carpeted hallway and walked toward Unit 4200, the penthouse suite. This was the luxurious sanctuary where Kendrick and Chloe had lived their fake glamorous life. I pulled a master key from my pocket and unlocked the heavy wooden door. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air in the penthouse was stale. The electricity and the climate control had been shut off weeks ago when I first evicted them. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago skyline and the deep blue expanse of Lake Michigan. I looked around the massive living room. When the eviction notice was served, my property manager had locked the unit down. The expensive modern furniture, the massive flat-screen televisions, and the ridiculous modern art pieces that Chloe had purchased with my money were still sitting exactly where they had left them. I felt absolutely zero sentimental attachment to anything in this room. It was all just a monument to their endless vanity. I took out my cell phone and called my property management team. I instructed them to send a full clearance crew up to the penthouse immediately. I told them to bring heavy-duty black trash bags and to pack up every single piece of designer clothing, every pair of expensive shoes, and every piece of superficial furniture left in the unit. I ordered them to sell whatever had value and donate the rest to a local charity shelter. I wanted the entire penthouse stripped down to the bare walls and the polished hardwood floors. I wanted every single trace of Kendrick and Chloe completely erased from my property. I stood by the window and watched the clearance crew arrive. They worked with ruthless efficiency, bagging up the silk shirts, the imported rugs, and the expensive perfumes. Within 3 hours, the massive luxury suite was completely empty. The echoes of their arrogant laughter and their toxic manipulation were swept away, leaving nothing but pristine, empty space. I contacted my top real estate brokers that very same afternoon. I told them I wanted the penthouse listed on the market immediately. The downtown real estate market was incredibly aggressive, and a top-floor unit with panoramic views of the lake was a highly coveted asset. Within 2 weeks, we received multiple offers from wealthy investors and corporate executives. I authorized the sale to an international businessman for a massive premium. The transaction was swift and seamless. When the final paperwork was signed, millions of dollars in pure profit were wired directly into my secure corporate holding accounts. I sat in my private study at home looking at the glowing numbers on my encrypted laptop screen. This money had originally been part of the silent safety net I had built for my son. It was supposed to be his safety and his security, but he had chosen to spit on that security. He had chosen to forge medical documents, claim I was senile, and extort his dying mother for a luxury vacation. That money no longer belonged to him. It needed a new purpose. It needed to be transformed into something powerful and protective. I scheduled a meeting with Jonathan Pierce, my lead corporate attorney. I sat across from him in his elegant mahogany conference room overlooking the city. I told Jonathan that I wanted to take the millions of dollars from the penthouse sale and establish a permanent legal trust. I did not want a standard charity that just handed out checks. I wanted a highly aggressive, fully funded legal aid organization. I instructed Jonathan to draft the founding documents for a new nonprofit entity. I named it the Vivian Foundation in honor of the most brilliant and resilient woman I had ever known. I explained the core mission of the foundation with absolute clarity. The Vivian Foundation would provide elite legal representation, top-tier financial auditing, and private investigation services completely free of charge to elderly minorities who were being financially exploited by their own family members. I knew from my own experience that African American seniors and other minorities were often targeted by greedy relatives. They were often tricked into signing away their homes, their pensions, and their dignity by children and grandchildren who saw them as nothing more than walking bank accounts. These elderly victims were usually too ashamed or too confused to fight back. They did not have access to ruthless corporate lawyers or highly skilled private detectives like I did. They were vulnerable, and they were being preyed upon in the dark. The Vivian Foundation was going to be their shield and their sword. I allocated enough millions to ensure that the foundation could hire the best prosecutors and investigators in the state of Illinois. If a greedy son or a manipulative daughter tried to forge a medical power of attorney or steal a classic car or drain a retirement account, the foundation would step in. We would freeze their assets, investigate their crimes, and drag them into federal court just like I had done to Kendrick and Chloe. We were going to give the power back to the older generation. We were going to show the predators that their elderly victims were no longer defenseless. Jonathan listened to my plan with profound respect. He immediately began drafting the Articles of Incorporation. He knew that I was taking the deepest pain of my life and forging it into an unbreakable weapon for justice. The legacy of my late wife was no longer tied to the selfish actions of our son. Her legacy was going to save hundreds of lives. A few days after the foundation was officially launched and fully funded, I woke up to a beautiful, clear morning. I put on a dark suit and drove my black sedan to the quiet, peaceful cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The grounds were perfectly manicured, the green grass wet with the morning dew. I walked slowly down the familiar stone path, breathing in the fresh, cool air. I felt completely whole. The heavy burden of betrayal and anger had been completely lifted from my shoulders. I had navigated the storm and I had brought the ship safely into the harbor. I reached the beautiful marble headstone resting under the shade of a large oak tree. The name Vivian Rollins was engraved in the stone along with the dates of her birth and her passing. I stood before the grave for a long time simply looking at the letters. I remembered her brilliant smile, her sharp mind, and the fierce protective love she had for our family. She had known the truth about Chloe and Kendrick long before I did. She had bolted that biometric safe to the floorboard of the Mustang, knowing that it would eventually lead me to the truth. She had protected me from beyond the grave. I knelt down slowly on the soft green grass. I held a single, perfect cherry red rose in my hand. The color was an exact match to the 1969 Ford Mustang we had spent 20 years restoring together. I placed the red rose gently on the top of the smooth marble headstone. I placed my hand flat against the cool stone. I closed my eyes and let a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my entire body. I leaned forward and spoke softly, allowing my voice to carry on the gentle morning breeze. "Your legacy is safe, my love," I whispered to the quiet cemetery. "The foundation is secure. The parasites are gone and they have been punished. You can rest now, Vivian. We finally won." I stood back up and smoothed the front of my jacket. I looked at the bright blue sky stretching endlessly over the city of Chicago. I am Dexter Rollins. I am 75 years old. I survived the betrayal of my own flesh and blood, and I emerged stronger than ever before. I turned my back to the grave and walked down the path toward my car. I was entirely alone, but I had never felt more alive. My life was finally my own, and the future was waiting to be built. The crisp morning air felt different today. It was the kind of air that signals a profound shift in the seasons of a man's life. I stood in the hallway of my home and looked at my reflection in the tall mirror. I am Dexter Rollins. I am 75 years old. For most of my life, I believed that blood was the strongest bond a man could build. I believed that because Kendrick was my son, I had an unbreakable obligation to protect him from the harsh realities of the world. Society constantly tells us that we must forgive our family members no matter how badly they treat us. We are told to keep the peace and turn the other cheek. But the last few months have taught me a difficult and necessary truth. Blood does not make someone family. Respect and loyalty make someone family. When you harbor a toxic person in your life simply because you share the same last name, you are not being a good parent. You are simply feeding a parasite. Setting boundaries with the people you love is the hardest thing a human being can ever do. It goes against every natural instinct you have to nurture and protect. But when those same people look at you and see nothing but an automated teller machine, you have to make a choice. You can either let them drain you until there is nothing left, or you can cut the cord and let them fall. I chose to cut the cord. I allowed my son to dig his own grave because true love sometimes means stepping aside and letting a criminal face the absolute consequences of his own actions. Kendrick made his choice the day he decided his mother's legacy was just a pile of rust taking up space. I walked down the hallway and pulled my old vintage leather jacket from the closet hanger. It was the same dark brown jacket Vivian had bought for me 30 years ago. The leather was worn and soft, carrying the faint, familiar scent of cedar and old memories. I slipped it on, feeling the comfortable weight settle onto my broad shoulders. I opened the heavy wooden door that led out to the garage and stepped inside. The space was no longer empty. Sitting directly in the center of the concrete floor under the bright overhead lights was my 1969 cherry red Ford Mustang. Vince Romano had kept his promise. His detailers had brought the car back to my home in absolute pristine condition. The paint gleamed like wet glass, reflecting the light with a flawless, deep red shine. The chrome bumpers were polished to a mirror finish. I walked slowly around the vehicle, running my calloused hand along the smooth, cool metal of the fender. This car was a monument to the 20 years of love and patience I had shared with my wife. It was not just a machine. It was a testament to survival and resilience. I opened the driver's side door and slid into the driver's seat. The restored leather creaked softly beneath my weight. I gripped the wooden steering wheel, feeling the familiar contours of the grain. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the silver key, and slid it into the ignition. I took a deep breath, turned the key, and pressed my foot on the pedal. The massive V8 engine roared to life with a deep, thunderous growl. The sound vibrated through the floorboards and echoed loudly against the garage walls. It was the sound of absolute freedom. I shifted the car into gear and rolled out of the driveway, leaving my quiet suburban neighborhood behind. I had arranged to have the Mustang transported out west so I could finally take the trip Vivian and I had always talked about. I found myself driving the classic car down the winding, beautiful curves of the Pacific Coast Highway. The transition from the cold Midwestern winds to the warm, salty air of the California ocean felt like a total rebirth for my soul. I rolled the windows down, letting the strong coastal breeze fill the cabin of the car. The sun was beginning to set over the vast expanse of the ocean, casting brilliant streaks of orange gold and deep purple across the evening sky. As I drove along the edge of the high cliffs, listening to the rhythmic roar of the engine and the crashing waves below, I felt a profound internal resolution. The heavy, dark clouds of betrayal that had shadowed my life for the past year were completely gone. I thought about Kendrick and Chloe sitting in their small concrete federal prison cells. They were completely stripped of their designer clothes, their luxury vacations, and their arrogant pride. They had tried to break me down and steal my dignity, but they only succeeded in destroying themselves. I felt no pity for them anymore. They were exactly where they belonged. I had reclaimed my life entirely. I had honored Vivian's brilliant foresight, and I had protected the empire we built together. I pulled the Mustang over at a quiet, scenic overlook. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the edge of the cliff, looking out at the endless horizon. The ocean was vast and powerful, reminding me that the world is so much bigger than the small, toxic bubbles we sometimes allow ourselves to get trapped inside. Before I started this long journey, I had visited Vivian's grave one last time. I placed a single perfect red rose on her smooth marble headstone. I stood in the quiet cemetery and whispered to her that her legacy was finally safe. I told her that her tormentors had been punished and that our wealth was now going to protect hundreds of other vulnerable seniors through the foundation we built in her name. The promise had been kept. I leaned against the hood of the Mustang, feeling the warmth of the engine radiating through the metal. The sun dipped lower, touching the very edge of the water. I looked directly ahead, speaking my truth to anyone who might be listening. Some people tell me I was too cold, too calculating. They say, "But Dexter, he is your son." I say he stopped being my son the day he threatened his dying mother. What do you think? Did I go too far, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop a super. Thanks if you want to support the channel. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and remember, never let anyone mistake your silence for weakness. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true wealth is never measured by the car you drive or the designer clothes you wear. True wealth is found in the integrity of your character and the respect you show to the people who built the foundation you stand on. We are often taught that we must forgive our family, no matter what they do to us. But tolerating abuse is not love, it is self-destruction. You have every right to protect your peace, your dignity, and your legacy, even if it means walking away from your own flesh and blood. If this story gave you the courage to stand up for yourself, do not forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below so we can keep building a community of strong survivors.